try to encapsulate concepts of mythos and logos into little parables and stories and paradigms. So yes, Sharon.
May I ask a question? Did we cancel Kenneth Smith's appearance from tomorrow to another time?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, it's March 9th is the new time. March 9th.
He lives in Texas, so he's been somewhat affected by the...
Oh.
Sharon, I live in Austin, Texas, and I can tell you it's been a horrendous week. No heat.
How have you been?
No water. I had to go and live with my son for a few days because I had no water. I just came back yesterday afternoon.
Well, you have Zoom, so we're happy to see you.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't even do any philosophy last week for about a week. I do Eric Christensen from Chicago. His meetings 3 times a week, and I couldn't go to any of them last week. So anyway, that's why Kenneth Smith is, yeah.
Yeah, I was worried that was going to happen, and it did.
Yeah. Yeah,
but he's getting better, though, I hope, because it seems to be resolving somewhat.
Oh, yeah. We went from 5 degrees about 4 or 5 days to today, it's about 70. It's going to 70. So happy.
Yeah, that's much better. So now all the utilities companies can work on catching up with all the...
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm glad I asked. Oh, that caught my eye, because I sat down yesterday and I really read that anti-Kant, because, you know,
yeah,
Kant and, tell me the utilitarian, Jeremy Bentham, and the other guy who's with Bentham. I'm blocking on their names now. We talked about all those principles for years, trying to come up with judgments. Right. So the anti-Kant was just, I enjoyed it.
Excellent. Have any of you read science fiction author Ursula Le Guin? She's famous for Earthsea Trilogy and Left Hand of Darkness, and she wrote kind of philosophical science fiction and fantasy, which is why I mention her. She also wrote collections of short stories, and one of them I think is one of the most kind of profound and pithy explorations of the problem with utilitarianism. And it's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I'll put it into I'll put it into the chat. And
Mill, the other guy.
Yeah, maybe you're thinking of Mill, Sharon.
Stuart Mill, yes. But Jeremy Bentham and Stuart Mill, yes. Thank you.
And the premise of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is that Omelas is a paradise in which everything is wonderful. Life is perfect. It's like a utopia. There's just one little hitch. The price for all of this is that in a small dark room where no one has to see or hear what's going on, a small child has to live in misery and torture. And for that price, everybody else gets to be happy. And the short story explores the whole how people deal with that and how many of them just don't think about it and they're happy because they never think about the small child suffering somewhere, and how some people, even though they could have everything that they want, they still can't do it, and they walk away from Omelas because it's just not okay. And so it really gets to that question of, can you play numbers with people, or does everybody matter? Should you be looking for solutions?
Makes me think of the kids in cages.
Yes. Yes. And it's a tuned up exploration of the question of slavery as well. It's like, slavery, it's easy to be against it when enormous numbers of people are suffering. So she tunes it all the way down to, what if it's just one person? And it makes you really examine your own ethics and sense of justice and right and wrong to ask the question that way. And then to say, what if it's not out in the open and you never have to look at it or see it or hear it or think about it? What if you could just file it away and say, let's just pretend? Is it okay then? It's like, Ursula Le Guin, I love you. That's just the perfect tuning up of the moral question of exploitation. So anyway, those of you who haven't read it, it's a short story. It's a
I'll
quick
definitely read it, because utilitarianism, I tend to be utilitarian, but I don't believe in sacrificing anybody. And it's a hard balance.
yeah. It's like there's another layer of ethics that needs to be added beyond utilitarianism.
Correct.
To take the math out of it.
Correct.
Virtue ethics.
Yeah, virtue ethics. We should treat people well because we should treat people well. It doesn't need to be justified. It can be, and this gets to some of the criticism of the sophists in classical Greece. It's like there are things that are true and important and that we need in order to build a civilization, but that we can't necessarily defend rationally, intellectually. You know, you can, it's so easy to create rational and intellectual systems of evaluation that miss the things that matter, so that they seem to make sense and seem to be self-consistent, but you find yourself doing these like moral equations with people's lives and saying, well, it must be okay to have this one person suffer because one is less than a billion. So sure, let's do it. It's like, so this was a problem that they wrestled with of, can everything be safely intellectualized? Or is the process of intellectualization so prone to missing the point that it's too dangerous to let it anywhere near the core values of things like, you know, we should treat people well because we should treat people well?
But the myth of healthcare in America is founded on that principle.
Yeah.
And I think the pandemic just ripped the hat off of that.
Yeah.
Because the commonality here is access.
Yeah.
And I think, and so we have a pandemic, yet the ruling powers are trying to yank the access from the people. And it's hard to understand.
Yes.
So the death toll. In fact, I had a little experience this morning. I sat down in front of the television and there was a physician, and I know, talking about the numbers, 500,000. She had tears in her eyes, and so did I. Because when you go back to 1980, and you alluded to this last week in your discussion, we didn't even have microscopes at the time to look at the bug that was wiping us out. Mm-hmm. And we had 625,000 people dead in America. It was a higher percentage of the then population. And now to have approached 500,000, we're 125,000 away from that number, is just unthinkable. And in my business, I don't like dead people. And yes. so all those dead people just strikes a really soft chord in my heart, you know, and it's very, very hard because it was needless.
Right.
You know, and I don't know if I'm stepping on anybody's toes. I'm telling you from the straight science perspective, and Richard is not here today because I went back and looked it up, and it's not only 4 countries, it's 7 countries led by women that have done so much, much better. Even some of the countries that have much, much lower socioeconomic levels than we do, percentage-wise, have done better. So it comes into the myths and what we believe and how we execute it and utilitarian.
Yeah, and of all the presidents throughout history, we had to have that president during pandemic. You know, I mean, just think about that odds and think about, I mean, why? Well, I mean, I sometimes look up and I go, what did we do so wrong that this has happened, you know?
But Jenny, we've had other potential situations. Ebola didn't get here.
Right.
SARS-1 didn't get here.
Right.
The bird flu didn't get here because the powers that be took care of it.
Exactly. They preempted, or they proactively did things so that it didn't create the kind of crisis and the kind of disaster that we had this year. I mean,
well, I just hope the populace learns from it, because the people that I know that are Republicans, I am so overjoyed because these numbers are coming down. I'm not happy yet, but a change. I want us to get below less than 1,000 people dead a day. That's a big number, guys. That's a big number. We have 4,000 people dying now, so 1,000, you know. And
it is less than 1,000 now. It is less than 1,000 now. Yes.
Oh, I'm happy to hear
It's dropped
that.
over the past 2 weeks.
Could I ask a question going back to what Rick said about utilitarianism?
Sure.
What if it's not one child that's hidden away, that's suffering, so everybody could have a pleasant life? Or let's not say good, but pleasant life. Because I'm thinking about Christianity. I mean, what if it's a God or a demigod that suffers in the cross for us? Would that be okay? Is it because he chose to suffer? Is it because he's a demigod and he bring that in themselves, and demigods are okay, or maybe even heroes are okay, but not somebody who didn't volunteer? I mean, I wonder whether Christianity in its own theology hasn't prepared you to accept suffering, except maybe not in this particular sense, but because suffering is a part of what it is. I mean, even if not the Christians, I mean, what about what's his name, the guy who brought fire?
Prometheus.
Okay. Prometheus sort of suffer for humanity.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
So is it okay for humanity to accept the goods when somebody else suffers for us? Or other primitive tribes, you know, they sacrifice people into jumping into volcanoes or whatever. I mean, like, it's just that part of our nature that we believe that there is a kind of equation that something has to suffer for us to be. I mean, I'm just asking that on a deeper level than just because I always thought of utilitarianism as pretty laced with hedonism in a way. You know, it's not deeper than just kind of hedonism plus. So
it's a critique you see in some of Kenneth Smith's writings, and also some of the philosophers he draws on, that they think that some people who think that they're doing calculations based on utilitarianism are actually doing it on some more profound ethics that we don't have a name for. But since we don't have a name for it, they call it utilitarianism, and then they don't notice the ways in which utilitarianism would excuse things that the deeper ethics would not excuse. And so it causes us to get confused about what exactly is it that we stand for, because we can't put a name on it and can't say it clearly. We come back to Hannah Arendt again about things that we can do, but we can't say or even quite think clearly. And what condition does it put us into when we're trying to think through ethical questions, but the tools we're using and the language we're using and the concepts don't actually fit what it is we're trying to accomplish. Marianne, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think that it is in our culture to have the scapegoating of people to do our suffering. But I think that really it is our own responsibility to own our own suffering and grow up and take responsibility for it. And I also went through Catholic school my whole entire life, always saw the cross, hated it. And I think it was a way for the nuns to avoid talking to people about their own suffering. And I think it was also way in my college days, I met some esoteric philosopher, religious person, and she said that Christ did not find his true humanity until he was on the cross. And that's when he became divine and said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" So that's esoteric Christianity.
Sharon.
Well, where is it? Philip, that was a very, very interesting take on Christ's crucifixion. And the myth or the story of Christianity is Christ's death was a fulfillment of prophecy. And leading up to it, if you remember the Garden of Gethsemane, he went and he prayed, and the Bible says that he sweated, his beads of sweat were like blood, because he did not want to do this. He did not want, he knew the suffering he was going to have. And even on the cross, he said, Father, let this cup pass from me. And then he said, it is finished when he died, because it was suffering for him. But I think it was fulfillment of prophecy. I think it was selling us the concept that he was dying so we could have a better life, which comes back to the utilitarian concept that one person is going to suffer for the good of us all, which is the question you're asking, right? But we truly believe, at least I believe, and it was just fulfillment of prophecy. And that fulfillment of prophecy, particularly from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is one of the foundations of Christianity.
That it's a gateway, a transformation in practice.
That's
to say
right.
we don't have to sacrifice
Exactly
anybody
right.
after this. We don't have to be bound by prophecy after this. This ties everything up in a neat bow and finishes it so that we can then move into a new relationship.
It's a transformation. That's exactly what it is. It's a way of thinking about being reborn, and the whole idea of even it's a way of explaining the unknown with death as well. And like that's everlasting, essentially. And essentially that suffering comes along, and that there's a reward at the end of this, that you're going through chaos. And
Yes.
there's a reward at the end of the chaos. So that's what I mean. It's a story.
It's a story.
There's some interesting stuff here around issues of suffering that ties right into what we've been talking about in the previous weeks. The Greek concept of pathos, the things that we suffer, whether they're painful or pleasant, setting that aside and just saying the things that are imposed upon us by nature, by the nature around us and within us, whether we will or not. Will we or nil we is a phrase that comes up in Kenneth Smith a lot too. There's categories of pathos here, right? So there's the category of pathos that is inescapable, right? If we are in nature, gravity is just going to be with us. Gravity is just going to be part of our life from beginning to end. It doesn't matter what our opinions are about it. It's just going to happen, right? That's like on one end of the scale of suffering and pathos. And it includes good things and bad things, right? So the fact that we bite into the apple and it tastes good to us is also part of the nature that we suffer under the Greek concept of suffering. It is how the nature inside of us and the nature outside of us work together. But then there are these other two critical categories of suffering. There's suffering that is needless, that is not driven by ananke, right? Ananke is the key divider between natural suffering and artificial suffering, the suffering that only happens because of the way we organize ourselves and the choices we make. So if we could have grown the wheat ourselves, but instead we enslave somebody else and make them do it, the suffering that they're experiencing is arbitrary. It's unnecessary. It's artificial. It's not imposed by nature. And what's fascinating about ideologies and cultures, societies that organize themselves around these forms of exploitation, is that they always cloak themselves in nature. They always say, well, it's not our fault that you're a slave. You just are a slave. That's who you are inherently, intrinsically. And we are inherently, intrinsically better. And it's natural for you to labor on behalf of other people. And it's natural for us to do the finer, better things while you do what you're capable of, right? They always say this. Slave societies, exploitative societies always invoke nature inescapably and say, this is just how it has to be. We're not doing this. It's just happening. Right. This is just how life is. And so there is this there is this second kind of suffering that is artificial, while constantly cloaking itself in the inevitability of nature, and saying, the reason you have to submit is because none of us has a choice. This is just how it is. But the third category of suffering is the more interesting one, because you can see what's wrong with the second category transparently once you dissect its excuses and look at the structures and who benefits and so forth. But the third category of suffering is the suffering that we choose, knowing that we will suffer, but that the reward is worth it. And so the suffering of an Aristos who says, I'm going to go after all my cherished beliefs and put them to the test and find out where I need to grow. I'm going to go at all of my egotistical opinions that make me so comfortable, and I'm going to pick them apart and find out how many of them have to give way to a more cosmopolitan view, that other people have rights, that I'm not the center of the universe, that I don't get to decide when I'm right and when I'm wrong just because I feel like it matters to me to be right. There is this lifelong agon or struggle that the Aristos chooses for themselves in order to overcome whatever primitive character they're born with and raised with before they become self-aware enough to start taking responsibility for themselves. And this kind of suffering is of an entirely different character than the other two, because if somebody chooses to suffer for a greater good, and they actually had meaningful consent, informed meaningful consent, then our feeling about that ethically is completely different than in either of the other two cases. It wasn't inevitable, but neither was it imposed, through coercion or force or ignorance. But it was chosen, perhaps for a good cause. I mean, then we can assess whether or not it was.
Well, I actually see a relationship between the first and the third category.
Yes.
Because if you look at the first category, I mean, gravity is not the best example, but I'll take your example. Yeah, it seems like it's some imposition on us. We like to fly, we like to float, or whatever.
Yes.
But as it turns out, if we live in a non-free category, we would, by nature, be suffering from a different kind of thing, because we are built within the structure of gravity. And therefore, in a sense, our organs would fall apart. We would become something else, if nothing else. And the third kind, it seems like you are trying to find a relationship in which you find that harmony, kind of like gravity is. You realize, actually, it's not a bad thing. It just felt like a strain at some level. But when you finally find a harmony between that and what existence is about, then it makes sense. So I kind of think those two are actually related, and they're more about an individual finding a relationship with whatever harmony that's a greater harmony. And the
Kenneth
second
Smith would
one
agree
is,
with you.
is a disorder.
Kenneth Smith would agree with you. He talks about that a lot, just the way you did. Yeah. Marianne, you had your hand up.
Okay, I was looking at examples. So the first kind of suffering, the natural suffering, I think of bliss. Like there are times when I'm meditating and I can just go into bliss and not feel so painfully aware of where I'm at. And the second thing, when you're talking about the slave, I kept thinking about Amazon and the techno split in our society. It's like, I'm not capable of working in an Amazon warehouse. It's so ugly, it's so productive and unitarianism. And yet I order all the time. And so I feel like I'm one of those people up there in the clouds having a great time.
Uh-huh.
And the third one, it's like when you say that they choose suffering, I was going back into the Middle Ages where people wore sackcloths, and there's something sadistic about that.
Yeah, there can be. I mean, it can, the suffering that we choose for ourselves can be, I guess, either artificial or natural. We could choose badly, Like we could decide that our body is some kind of a sin and it's tempting us to evil and we need to punish the body to liberate ourselves from it. And then we're torturing ourselves, which is sadistic. But we could do it the other way around, right? We could say, you know, if I'm born with a lung condition in which I'm subject to bronchitis frequently, I might choose the discipline of martial arts to do the work, exercise over and over, to do the breathing exercise until eventually I overcome that. But to overcome it, I have to suffer. It's years of work and strain and exertion to get to the point where my lungs get strong enough that I stop experiencing the bronchitis. And so I think you're right that I focus too much on the choice and not enough on what you and Phil are saying on is it a choice that leads us into a greater harmony with nature, or does it lead us, you know, into a greater chaos of artificial, you know, choices that put us out of sync and out of health and harmony. And there's somewhere in this, you know, there's the possibility of kind of a post-utilitarian ethos for medicine that goes beyond utilitarianism and looks at these deeper questions of, you know, for example, if I'm rationing healthcare, do I have to ration healthcare? Is it naturally imposed upon me to ration it? Or is it because the insurance company that's paying the bills has chosen that some people should suffer so that other people can profit? And so this distinction of natural suffering from artificial suffering gives us a basis for making decisions about whether we should restructure things, you know, in our social relations in order to remove the unnecessary suffering. You know, it's been too many years since I read Le Guin's short story, so I don't remember whether the child had to suffer or if that was just the bargain that they had struck. And who knows if there was some other bargain that would have been better, but they stopped looking because most of them got what they wanted and thought, well, this is good enough, right? And so there's that question of kind of how much artificial suffering will we tolerate versus, you know, how much are we willing to work for greater justice? Looked like you were thinking something, Sharon.
I am, because, you know, so, and this is where my experience is. So you're standing in the delivery room and this infant comes out and you can see from the deformities that he is going to lead a life of suffering.
Right.
Where is that category? Because he's born into a family. And until he makes his exit, it's going to be pain.
Yes, that's right.
And we would discuss issues like that in ethics committees, utilitarian, deontological. Is it your duty to continue at all costs because it's your duty? That's the hard, fast of it. Or do you say, well, you know, there are 4 other children at home and there's the mother, there's the father, and this situation is going to be difficultly tenable. Well, what decision do you make? But I go back to, you come into the world with a template for suffering. Where is that in this?
Yeah. Well, that's the natural part, right? You were born into a nature you didn't choose for yourself, and you're born into a family that has its own characters and its own family character together that you didn't choose. And on top of that, you were born in an unfinished condition because that's how Homo sapiens is, in a way in which, as an infant, you're incapable of making an informed choice. So you're born into a state in which nature is imposed on you from multiple directions, and you are incapable of choosing how to respond to that. So others have to do it on your behalf. And that existential condition of not having any free will when you're born is itself imposed by nature. So there's this level at which it feels like if human beings are making choices that they must be artificial ones, but that's not necessarily true.
True, yes.
They could align their choices with the nature of the situation to try to figure out what the ethics might be.
Well, you to me raise a deeper issue in terms of social and political issues, because in such a world, utilitarian world in which most people will live a good life, except there's some invisible suffering somewhere, whether it's this child, some. It seems to me you have to have already a society that is virtuous. Because if you don't, a democratic society will not work, because people will say, forget it. Let's go with the numbers or whatever, okay? Or let's go with my pleasures. So if we already live in a corrupt society in which most people, are busy buying television sets or whatever they're doing, then it seems to me it's just so easy to forget. And even if you don't forget, you say, what's the big deal? Like, that's God's will or whatever it is, okay? So therefore, in a sense, we have to reform, maybe particularly in a democratic society, to have ethics and virtues integrated into the system. Otherwise, you could say, well, yeah, but that would be the same thing as a tyranny. But at least in a tyranny, you could have a wise guy overrule that if he's a good wise guy. So I'm committed to democracy, but I could see how corrupted it is and how difficult it is to reach that point where you say, no, that child there, like, is worth paying attention to. Because we make it so easy. Like Marianne says, like, you hate Amazon, but on the other hand, yeah, it's easy. They make it easy to buy from them.
They make it easy, don't they?
It's like we all these tiny steps of sin that turns out that, when you multiply it, it turns out, oh no, I didn't realize I was doing that. But on the other hand, if you were like question every move you make, then life is so burdensome on you. Then you wonder, like, am I really willing to go through all that trouble to save that child? I mean, come on now. I mean, you see how that goes? It's just very difficult in that situation.
I just like to bring up one thing, Rick, if you may. So
Please.
I was watching the statistics yesterday, and there's this country that has had one death from COVID.
Yeah.
Did you see it? It was Bhutan.
Yeah. That's because they have a happiness index rather than.
Right.
Well, I don't know if it's a happiness index or the way the society is set up.
Yes.
They only have 750,000 people to start off with.
Mm-hmm.
So one death, all the ministers of government are public health experts, but they set the example, and they do not even have an effective or efficient number of practitioners per population. They have one ventilator in the whole country, and yet they pull this off.
Wow. I know. I think they're the country that has not a GNP, but I think an HNP.
They do.
They actually have that a philosophical underpinning.
Yeah, they're structured around not the question of how much money are we making, but is everybody happy? Yeah. And I think they're the only country that uses the HNP instead of a GNP.
Yes.
And Sharon, I had no idea. I'd never connected that and asked myself the question, what was happening in Bhutan under the pandemic, given that. But now I see the pieces come together and it makes sense, right? It's their orientation.
That's right. That's right. And it's just the way it's the way the society, the people in the society relate to each other.
Yes. Marianne,
it's a community.
Exactly.
So in our culture, I think we have the economy of scarcity.
Right.
And I look at Texas, and I think Naomi Klein wrote something about disaster capitalism. And the people that get so rich, they're hoarding all these resources, and then they get to just fly off and leave the disaster behind them. And I think, I don't know Bhutan, but I do know, I had a friend who worked in the Peace Corps in Tonga, and they didn't have refrigeration. And because they didn't have refrigeration, it was shaming to hoard. So if somebody came home with a lot of fish, it was a party.
Right. Everybody eats.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of things you guys made me think of. One of them, Phil talking about the lots and lots of tiny sins that add up in big numbers reminds me of there's a fictional work. It's a work of satire by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett called Good Omens. And I'm sure Richard would be jumping up and down if he were on today's call because it's a fantasy novel that's sort of a comedy about the apocalypse, if you can imagine such a thing.
Oh.
And it's about the end times and Revelation coming, but not going exactly the way anybody prophesied, and in fact turning into a hilarious commentary on society. And in Good Omens, there are two main characters, one of whom is a not terribly well-respected angel and one of whom is a not terribly well-respected devil, who've sort of been on opposite sides for all of creation, except they kind of like each other because they both kind of understand the world and you know how it works and what's interesting about it more than the other angels and devils do. The other angels and devils are so focused on the apocalypse and preparation for the Great War, and these two are sort of like, yeah, but that cafe has really nice tea cakes, right? You know, they're sort of like, I don't know if I want an apocalypse necessarily. So this novel is about how everything goes off the rails in a hilarious direction. They made a TV adaptation of it recently, I think on Netflix, and it was shockingly good. Neil
What
Gaiman.
is it called? I have Netflix now.
Good Omens.
Good Omens.
Good Omens. And it's because Neil Gaiman was involved in it. They actually added an episode that wasn't a chapter in the book, but he wrote it. And it's just a series of vignettes going throughout history of the two of them showing up at, you know, the witch trials or Shakespeare's attempt to get a first, you know, play going, or moments, the French Revolution, moments in history. The two of them are just sort of wandering there going, so, you know, what's your side doing here? And what's my side doing here? And let's go get a drink. You know, it's hilarious and it fits, but you know, you don't normally see an adaptation of a book that's so good. The reason I bring it up is because, you know, all the other devils are all about, oh, I tempted a priest and he's fallen and he's ours and now his soul is ours, and oh well, I caused a, you know, this famine to happen and this number of people will die. But our little devil character, who's one of the two main characters, is like, well, I found a way to make the roundabout in London slightly more frustrating. And they all look at him like, are you stupid? Don't you know what evil's about? He's like, no, you guys don't get it. Do you know how many people drive the roundabout every day? Oh. And now for the rest of their lives, every time they go to work, every time they go home, they're going to be a little meaner to each other. They're going to be a little more selfish to each other. The scale of the evil that I did by making this roundabout a little more frustrating far exceeds anything you guys ever accomplished with your little famines and the tempting individual souls. And they all just look at him like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But it goes right to what Phil said. It's, you know, large numbers of teeny tiny evils add up, right? They add up. It's, everybody can be mostly good, and yet in the end, something evil can result from it. It's a curious thing about big numbers in that regard. The other thing, Phil, that you said that I was thinking about here is about democracy, and we go back to Aristotle when he says every form of government has the good form and the bad form, and it all comes down to, is the population voting on the basis of anything more than what they want? If all they're doing is voting based on their appetites and desires, then it's the worst of all possible governments. Worse than tyranny, worse than, you know, a bad oligarchy. It's the worst, because then you get enormous numbers of people committed to doing the wrong thing. But if the people stand for something, if they have virtues, if they're trying to make a better world, and that's the basis for their voting, then it's the best of all possible governments, because it's hard to go wrong when you have an enormous mass of people, all of whom know what you're supposed to be doing and can help to correct and make things better. And so he's like, well, that's the thing about democracy, is we have to be able to make that distinction, or else we don't know which government we're talking about. And of course, in the modern world, we don't make that distinction. Democracy is democracy, right? It just is what it is. I see James has got his hand up, and then Sharon.
Yeah, what you said, is that what Marx's argument is, that people voting for their interests, you know, and not their desires, based on their desires?
Yeah, you know, when Marx talks about false consciousness, that's part of how he defines it, is when people's desires are out of sync with their interests, they're victims of false consciousness, because now they're working against the things that would be best for them. And of course, what Heraclitus told us is that this is a very difficult problem. It's very hard for people to figure out what's actually in their interests, which is why it's so weird that all of modern politics and economy are founded on the premise of enlightened self-interest. You know, the reasonable person, that people more or less know what's in their interest. When all these philosophers are saying, but how can you start with that as your default state when it's the hardest thing to achieve? There's a flaw at the foundation of the modern world.
Comes down to how you define happiness, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
it's open. It's open to whatever you want to say happiness is.
Yeah, we have that problem with the descriptivist approach to language. Says that whatever we say a word means is what it means, and thus it's incredibly easy to lose terms that are desperately important for being able to construct a viable civilization and have them turn into, well, they say in English, right? Everything turns into a synonym for what? Money, sex, you're a dum-dum. It's like there's this sort of process of decay in which literally and not literally come to mean the same thing, which then you can't communicate clearly with each other. And so happiness, are we talking about your infatuations and momentary transient manias, or are we talking about how to be in sustainable harmony with the world so that happiness kind of blossoms and is a fruit of the tree of your life? And we erase the distinction by calling them both happiness.
Right. So in this Kenneth Smith's system of thinking, would the Aristoi decide what the happiness would mean, and then he would kind of like.
What a good question. Okay, let's talk about that. That's a really good question. So, the Douloi Banausoi Aristoi framework based on Begriff, Verstand, Vernunft. The Douloi are driven by how things seem to them. Doke moi, right? It seems to me. I got to put that in there. It seems to me, from which you get dogma and doxa and other things like that. Other modern terms all fall out of that phrase doke moi. And the problem with doing things the way it seems is that nature loves to hide. So just because something seems a certain way doesn't mean it is that way. Just because you feel angry doesn't mean that the situation actually warrants anger. You might be responding to something that happened to you when you were a little kid, and it's just reminding you of it, and you don't know that that's why you're so angry right now, right? This is Freud was playing with this, right? It's like how much of to what extent are our feelings a good guide, and to what extent are they not a good guide, has exactly the same variability as, is happiness the sustainable, sane thing, or is happiness the mania of the moment? So in this case, it's that, are you living in a culture that has helped you to cultivate your emotions so that they're a fine-tuned sensor for putting you in sync and in harmony with the nature around and within you? Or are you living in a society that has done the exact opposite to exploit you for profit? Because if it's the latter, your feelings are a terrible guide. But if it's the former, then they're an excellent guide. Which means we're in a state in which we can't actually answer the question of whether you should be making decisions based on your feelings. The answer is, well, it depends on a lot of things, right? The dualic perspective is standing on shifting sand. The thing that they want to use as their foundation might sometimes be an excellent foundation, and other times it might be the worst of all possible foundations. So Douloi can't be the ones to decide this, because their basis is just not. It's not reality based enough. But by the same token, it can't be Banausoi, because with their focus on Verstand, they're going to make decisions based on their ideologies and systems of belief, their rational intellectual schemas, which could be, as we see, 100% divorced from reality. They may have no basis on reality at all, right? They might not. The ideas are just as able to be either in sync or out of sync as feelings are. So neither of them is a good basis for making these decisions. And that takes us to the Aristoi, where this is where we see that the Aristos is not another of the same kind of the Douloi and the Banausoi, because this is the first type that doesn't think that it contains the answers. The other two both think they contain the answers. They can look inside themselves, either in their heart or in their mind, and tell you what's true. That's what they think. That's what makes them Douloi and Banausoi. But what makes someone an Aristos is that they see beyond that. They understand that that's not true. They understand that nature is the source of truth, and that we have to take things back to the world to figure out if they're true or not. And furthermore, that our efforts to figure out whether they're true or not are imperfect. And so, and Aristos would never speak with absolute authority on a subject in the way that a doulos or Banausos just, routinely will give their opinion as though it's the word of God, because they're that sure of themselves. And Aristos is like, you can't ever be that sure of yourself. This is where the better parts of the scientific method come into play, where we say, well, this is the best model I have at the moment, but don't confuse this model with the truth. If we can find a better model, let's do it. But in the meantime, we'll use this because it's better than the other ones that we have. So when you say, would the Aristoi be the ones to decide it? The purpose of the Aristoi is to function not as authorities, but as midwives for the process of discovering the authority in nature. They could do a good job or a bad job, but that's their duty, is to work at that. I think Sharon had her hand up, and then Phil.
Well, this is a question. So there's the Aristoi, the Douloi, and the Banasoi, but there's this overarching question that I struggle with that says, man is basically evil. The struggle is to be good. And so I don't know. I think all those three groups would fit into that generalization, but I do not know. I think it's a philosophical question. I don't know what the answer is.
Do you want to explore that a little with us? Should we dig into that together?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me put a pin in that for a second and just see what Phil had in mind, and then we'll come back to that and we'll do that, Sharon. Let's explore that together.
Yeah, I place this under the contrast between appearances and realities. I mean, and I'll go back to what I said several weeks ago about Cézanne, because many people think that a lot of his later paintings, there are a lot of blank parts in which he let the canvas expose itself. And they said that's the predecessor to being a nothingness, okay? And he was willing to portray nothing. But in fact, what he was trying to do was he was, in some sense, a kind of a late impressionist, was that he couldn't find the correct colors in which to represent the thing itself. So he left a blank. And I think the problem is that we've grown up in a society, whether there's a primitive society or not, that we have some ambiguities about appearances, and that's why we develop this sort of understanding of system in order to get to this. But I think we've gone overboard and don't understand that there is a middle ground, which is to remain silent. In other words, the absence of language beyond language itself, right? In other words, I think that's why I feel bad about the fact that we've devalued poetry to such a degree.
Yes.
Because poetry kind of dance around that. They don't really speak about that part, but they kind of go around it. And we want to just name things as if the naming of the things will solve it, because the thing that's not named is the nothing. In which, like, I'll take the ice cream cone, you can have the nothing, since you're into nothingness. Right? So I think because we're so dependent, I think it wasn't that long ago that I think words themselves migrate. They still do. But the dictionary has kind of like, let's look it up in the dictionary. I mean, that's how we solve the arguments, in which some say, no, this is deeper than the dictionary, and people is going to look at you like, you're some kind of heretic or something. So I think we have to retrieve that place that's in between, that remains silent, but there's something there, and I think I think that's what wisdom is to get to that point where you say, I can't really say anything, but there's something going on. I mean, that's about all you could say, right? So that's why my art is about the relationship between art philosophy and, I would say, the human spirit, because that part is kind of like nebulous to a certain degree. So that's what I have to say about that part, which is what we're dealing with. Is we're left with this, like, you're either on this side or that side. And it seems like appearances by itself is not good enough, but systems by itself is not good enough.
Right. Okay, before we tackle Sharon's thing, I see James got his hands up. Let's just see what that is real quick before we die, because it's going to be a big thing, right? Is humanity fundamentally evil?
Slightly respond to what Sharon's question is proposing, that asking a question whether the idea of evil, good and evil. I mean, I think it's symbolic of about the question of can something come from nothing?
Mm.
If you believe that there is just nothing, everything comes from nothing, and that's all there is, and then your something is is trying to fight against that, as though it's an evil thing. But maybe it's like Heraclitus is that it's there all the time, but it's also extensive with that river that's continues to flow, but it's a different river every time, every moment, and so it's maybe it's an inherent part of our existence, our being. That being can't be without nothing, and vice versa.
Right. Oh, that was Hegel's take, right?
Yeah.
He thought that Heraclitus's concept of becoming resolved the what appeared to be an absolute contradiction between being and non-being. Mm-hmm. He said, rather than us being in an absolute sense or not being in an absolute sense, it's neither. We are simultaneously being and non-being, and that's the process of becoming. So we stop being what we were a moment before and become the new thing, and then we're that, but only for a moment.
Yeah, I came across the idea of the word Dasein actually comes from Hegel. The Heidegger used, and it represents being and nothing. That was interesting because I've been reading Hegel, Heidegger, and I thought the word Dasein, but the origin came from Hegel. So it is being, the whole idea just kind of like, stands out for me.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
So, Marianne, go ahead.
I'm reading Leonard Schlein, and this is mostly for Phil. And he says that the original abstract expressionist is language. It's like we are trying to get our heads around what something abstract. And I like that.
Language as an abstract expressionist art form. I've never had that idea before. That's intriguing.
Isn't it? Leonard.
I'm going to have to ponder that. I enjoyed his Alphabet and the Goddess. I thought, he had a lot of interesting stuff in there, and I know he's got other books. I should do a little more of reading with his work. So, so Sharon puts her once again. Sharon, I'm not a philosopher, but Sharon once again puts her finger right on one of the core questions of philosophy, which is the fundamental nature of human beings. Are we fundamentally good? Are we fundamentally evil? What's the deal? And there are at least 3 clearly distinguishable answers that are present for us to play with and bounce off of to find other answers. But the I won't say Judeo-Christian. I'll say the Christian perspective is that we were born with sin and we needed to be saved. That if we're not saved, we go to hell. There's an apocalyptic scale to this, right? And in hell, we'll be tortured for all eternity, and we'll deserve it because that's how bad we are. But we can be saved. We should be saved. And if we are saved, then we're all good for all eternity in a pure, perfect way. So what we have is a sort of a cosmology that draws off of Zoroastrianism and some other kind of ultra polarizing worldviews in which it's focused on purity, on absolute purification of 2 poles, and everything in the middle is excluded. and is going to end up on one of the two sides. The law of the excluded middle that Aristotle built his logic out of is extremely compatible with the absolutely polarized cosmology of heaven and hell, and what that implies about human character. That we're sort of right now, as we live, we're somewhere we haven't quite resolved. We're like in a quantum state. We don't know the velocity or the speed. Neither of them's been pinned down. But at some point, we end on a resolution that leaves us either perfectly good, thanks to God's grace, and we get to live in heaven, or perfectly evil and in need of destruction. And so this is one model of what good and evil are, and where people fit in the world. But there are other models that are quite different from that one. And so it means, to answer the question, we sort of have to figure out which of these frameworks are we working with. This becomes a Kenneth Smith exercise, in which the goal is to collect alternative frameworks and use them to triangulate upon the problem. Phil, you got your hand up.
Yeah, if there was such a thing and there's a resolution and that everything becomes perfect, I myself would find after a while I'll be bored out of my gourd, because I think of myself as a thing that's constantly in the process of transformation. That is actually where it is, rather than ending finally at a stasis and there's an answer, because the question becomes more important. I once wrote a little article that I taught with. It's called "The Being of Nothingness." Not being and nothingness, not being and nothingness, being of nothingness. And it's for the art students. And I said, the important part is that nothingness is not, the being of nothingness has something to do with the potentiality of being that comes out of the thing and becomes, as you say. So that's what it is. So therefore, in a sense, that's why reason, in some sense, has been downgraded to a degree, and imagination is upgraded to a degree, because imagination is able to coax the being out of the nothingness and let it be born, like you said, the midwife that produces possibilities, and this continues on unto the next and the next. And there's not necessarily, like at the end, there is actually a destination, but actually it's the constant evolutionary process that goes on, that what the creative potential is. And so, like I said, I'm not sure. No, I'm not going to guarantee that at the end, when everything is perfect, I just remember this cartoon from a long time ago. These two angels that were talking to each other. They were like in heaven and everything's good, and they're like sucking on these ice cream cones. And one angel said to the other one, it says, "Is this all there is?" Like, everything's good, but is this it? So I just thought that was a very funny little cartoon. That's sort of like slightly cynical angels that thought that there was more to it than just like, oh, we have ice cream cones every day. Like, great. So I think there's something about any kind of thing that comes to a final resolution in itself. There might be a flaw in that as well, because of a living process. Of a dead process, probably not.
Yeah. There's a interesting challenge human beings have when they try to imagine purity or perfection. We sort of think we're doing it, but when we scratch the surface, we sort of realize we still aren't succeeding at envisioning it. And part of the reason is that in nature, nothing is pure or perfect. Everything is constantly flowing and transforming. So either purity and perfection apply to all conditions, or to none of them, when we try to explain nature in terms of purity and perfection. And for this reason, we find that purity and perfection live more in Verstand systems of thought than they do in the begriff nature that we experience in the world around us. We don't actually experience unchanging, pure, perfect, things that don't interact with anything else and are not contaminated in any way. And Parmenides wrestled with this a lot when he was trying to envision the concept of absolute being that led to his second philosophy, the being is philosophy that Plato later embraced, and that was so compatible with the either or of Aristotelian logic. And his argument was, this is how you get to the Platonic unchanging forms, is because you can't find a place for purity or perfection anywhere in the world. So Plato hypothesizes the other world where there are pure, perfect things. And then to try to make the relationship between them, he says, well, since purity and perfection are obviously better than impurity and imperfection, according to his schema, that must be the real world. And we're just some kind of reflections and shadows and shimmering. And this is all an illusion. There's no real change and there's no real mixing of things, because that would be icky, and only purity is good. There's sort of this you can sort of see how this whole intellectual schema, necessarily arose for him as a way to resolve the fact that he could find no place for purity and perfection in the world as we experience it. And there's two ways to resolve that. You can either say, well, then maybe purity and perfection aren't real ideas.Maybe these are concepts that don't actually fit in the actual world anywhere. They're like unicorns or dragons. They're fun to think about and imagine, but they're not practical in any way. Or you can say, well, then we need to escape from this world to another world. This is when Kenneth Smith says all philosophy is either existential or escapist. He's saying either the framework is built around how you actually naturally are, the forces that are incumbent upon you, and the pathos of what we experience, or you try to escape from the natural world by positing some other world and saying that's the real one and not this one, because I love my ideas too much to give them up. I'd rather give up the world and keep my idea. And so I'm going to make this other world in which the ideas are all true. And, that's where we have to go. So there's sort of a direct relationship between purity cultures, perfection-oriented cultures, and the positing of a second world, which is the source of meaning, and which is the divine or sacred world. These naturally go hand in hand. It's not that there's no other reason you could posit a second world. It's that if you are committed to concepts of purity and perfection and the excluded middle, there's really no way to resolve the dilemma except to eventually posit a second world and say that that's the real one. What Plato did, what Parmenides did, what the medieval church did, they were not arbitrary. They didn't just happen to do that. They had to do that. It was either that or change their belief system. It was the only way to reconcile it with the world as it actually is. Marianne, you've got your hand up.
Oh, okay, I'm not muted. So Kenneth Smith at one time gave this kind of duality, like the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And when I thought of the tree of knowledge, I thought of the Garden of Evil and how we had to behave correctly. And when I think of the tree of life, I see it more as a triangle, and then there's a middle path that comes from the apex of the triangle. And that, to me, represented the excluded middle. And in the tree of life, you have severity and mercy on one side. And that is our illusion of how we walk through the world between purity, the ethos that we have. And the middle path is to walk with the grace of being. And in that grace, in that nature, accepting nature and our own nature, there is something about being beautiful inside our souls or whatever.
Yeah, the Navajo concept of walking in beauty as being in tune and in harmony with the world around you, the way that it's the healthiest and most sustainable for it to go. You see this sort of echoed among the Greeks when Aristotle says that you can only get so far with intellect and reason, and at some point you have to apply value judgments, and that one of the most important value judgments to apply is it beautiful? That you sort of see the working out of a virtue in the form in the way that it produces beautiful results. And the concept of beauty there is not, again, just the surface of, I made a painting and it's pretty, but that what we're seeing reflects the deeper harmony of the cosmos brought to life before us, and that's the sign that were on the trail of a genuine virtue or a genuine sustainable government or a genuine sustainable form of society. He's constantly coming back to this question of taste and beauty and art as the guides to finding the hidden harmony without ever using the words hidden harmony. You know, he's like, there's Heraclitus hiding throughout Aristotle. He just doesn't come out and say it. So for us, you know, it means that there are at least two radically different schemas of good and evil. And in one apocalyptic, purity, perfection-oriented schema, good and evil are defined outside this world. And then we measure this world in terms of that external definition. So that's the medievalist concept of Christianity went through a lot of different phases, and so it's got a lot of different things to say about good and evil. But the medievalist concept, that's 1,000 years really well documented. We can use that as one of our touchstones. And so that is, God has defined good and evil for us as these pure, perfect things. Those are the measuring rulers that the world we live in will be measured against, including human nature, to decide which of the two we are, which of the two we get sorted into. You guys, any of you fans of Egyptian mythology? Sharon, a little bit for Phil. So I can't remember which exact deity it was that after you died would hold up the scales and put a feather on one side and your heart on the other. And that's how they measured whether you were good or evil. Because if you had lived a good life, your heart would be light and it wouldn't weigh any more than a feather.
There must be Osiris. I think there's Osiris.
Him or Anubis, or I don't know. There were. I can't quite remember today which one it is. Oh, Maat, maybe. Maybe that's why she had the feather as her symbol. So, but at any rate, I see a connection between the judgment of God in the medievalist Christian and the actual measurement of the heart against the feather in the Egyptian. They're both trying to sort out this either or question of, you know, the deities will impose this question and they'll measure it and that will give you your answer. Because if they weren't there to tell you the answer, that concept of good and evil doesn't give us any way to answer it. The meaning comes from outside, not from inside. So if all we had was the inside, we couldn't resolve the question. It would be unresolvable. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say that we can't just totally slam Plato either.
He's great.
I want to bring up a movie that I like a lot. It's not my favorite movie, but one I like very much, by Woody Allen, called The Purple Rose of Cairo.
Yes.
You've seen it.
I saw that in the theater.
I know, it's a wonderful movie, and basically, I'll just tell you the synopsis. This gal who was just mistreated by some brute of a husband who just, you know, was like gambling all the time and just beats her up for no reason because she's a woman and all that. And so she finds that her only escape in life was to go to the movies. And then one day she went to this movie, The Purple Rose of Cairo, so often that the guy actually walked out of the movie, which freaked everybody out. Okay?
Yes, steps out of the screen.
And then eventually what they did was they kind of fell in love, right? And in fact, he was so perfect. Like one day he was walking by, you know, some prostitute. He was like, you know, would you want some of this and that? He said, I can't because I'm so in love with this gal, right?
Yes, the perfect answer.
It's like, wow, you know, these prostitutes were just so impressed by him. You know, like they treated him very nice, but they didn't offer any sex and all that. So finally, what happened was the real actor came on the scene because he was messing this whole thing up. I mean, the character, right? And so, like, he met the gal and talked to her about this and that, and so she was undecided about, like, you know, do I want the real thing or do I want this other ideal thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, she finally was convinced, you know, it's good to be living in the real world, and so she kind of semi falls in love with this guy. And of course, when the thing was resolved, he left. And then afterwards, she went back to her husband and got treated badly again. And she finally moved out. And we see in the last scene, she was watching the movie, a Fred Astaire movie. I'm saying, you know, this guy's arguing that not all movies are just like about intellectual, philosophical, virtuous thing. There is actually some room for escapism, because in a world that's so cruel,
Yes,
it gives you this other world in which you know that it's better than this world. So I mean, so in some sense, you could sort of see the allure of this sort of ideal world in some sense, right? Because we do live in a very cruel world, and that in some cases, for at least some people, there's no escaping that, and the only way you can escape it is to indulge yourself in this other fantasy, which is not real, where the guy is absolutely just so perfect that
yeah,
you can't resist it. And she actually had trouble deciding which guy to be with, right? So
right.
I mean, so that's why I said you can't really slam our desire for that as well. I mean, yeah, that is a false promise in one sense, but in some sense, it's kind of like a good false promise, because it gives you
Yeah.
a kind of hope, right?
You know, I'm going to call on Sharon in a sec, 'cause she's got her hand up, but there's a couple of things about that. You know, one of them is, you know, Plato was an Aristos. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to confuse the issue here. I criticize him a lot because he's the major pillar of modern civilization in ways that we don't examine very often. But criticism because he's awesome. I mean, you know, those dialogues are interesting. He really explores themes, and he really pitted a lot of different philosophies against each other in a memorable way that survived over thousands of years. And as an example of that, Ernst Cassirer, who I've mentioned before on these calls, he's probably the major 20th century writer on the subject of mythos before Joseph Campbell's popularization. He argued that Plato's idealized world of pure, perfect forms was only wrong if we took it the way Plato meant it, but not if we took it a different way. If we took it the way Plato meant it, as that's actually how the cosmos works, then he's wrong. Because you can see that it doesn't fit at all with the natural flow and transformation of the cosmos. But Ernst Cassirer says it actually is an extraordinarily good model of our own unconscious. That when we interact with the world, we are measuring everything according to these concepts that we have in our head, and that we are evaluating whether things are good or evil, or is that the perfect chair, or so on. And that activity is so important to understanding the human condition that if Plato hadn't proposed that, someone would have to do it. It's a necessary model. It just needs to be situated correctly, not out here, but in here. And that putting it in here doesn't make it unreal. It's still real, and it's still important, because the human condition is to be this amphibian caught between the world inside and the world outside. And unless we can actually say that and model it, then we don't know who we are and what we're doing. So Plato did amazing things. You know, I don't intend to slam him at all. The other little thing I wanted to add was Marx is often held up as hating religion. And when they want to say that he hated religion, they use this quote: "Religion is the opiate of the masses."
Yes.
And they say, see, he thought it was a delusion. But during Marx's era, the best medicine available was opium. That was, you know, if you had pain, if you were suffering, opium was the best you could possibly do. That's what you gave people who were suffering the greatest pain. And so it's almost certain that when he said it's the opiate of the masses, what he meant is life involves a lot of pain and a lot of struggle. And if it weren't for religion, we wouldn't make it. You know, religion is what allows us to live our lives, to manage the pain, to be able to have a meaningful and productive life. And modern day atheists can't see it that way, because we don't know what it's like to live in a world in which it's pretty much that or nothing, right? We don't understand how important opium was to a 19th century speaker talking about, you know, the human condition. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, religion, just to tag on to that, religion allows you to deal with the ignorance of life by what I call a method of transference. You know, the name of the Egyptian god, I was not going to forget this, was Anubis. Because I can see it in my eyes, and they had the scale right, with the feather and the heart. Yes. And if you didn't meet it, then your heart got eaten and you went to hell.
Yes, right? Yes, yes. Anubis, thank you. Yes. So that's good. That's good. I'm glad you brought that up. So, okay, so this is one model. And you know, just like Kenneth Smith talks about existentialist versus escapist, another pair of terms that we can use here are immanental versus transcendental. Right? Immanental versus transcendental. And the cosmology in which the world has no meaning of its own and meaning has to be imposed from outside the world is a transcendentalist philosophy or cosmology. It transcends nature and says the only way to make sense of nature is with something outside of nature that can explain nature. This is the medievalist cosmology. The medievalist cosmology is that God is not natural. God is pre-natural. God invented nature. God could exist without any nature. And God is the source of meaning and language and thought. And God imposes that meaning upon his creation and gives it a meaning it would not otherwise have. Just like the human soul, born so wicked that it deserves to be tortured for all humanity, can be redeemed through even the slightest touch of God's grace. God's grace gives us the goodness that's required to be all good for all time, to be worthy of living in heaven. So there's this potent source of all meaning and magic and transformation and orientation in life in the medievalist worldview, but it's not to be found anywhere in nature. Now, the Greek conception was the opposite. It was immanentalist. They thought there were gods, but the gods are in nature. The gods are part of nature. And the gods rise and fall just like everything else rises and falls throughout the world. And that although the gods are excellent reference points for meaning and understanding, right? If we think about Poseidon when we're about to set on a voyage, it may remind us to be careful about the ocean in ways that we wouldn't be if we didn't stop to think about Poseidon before we went out on our little boats. And so Poseidon becomes a frame of reference for meaning, but not the source of it. It's only a concentration of the meaning that is already present in the ocean itself. He's only a personification and sort of metaphorical clarity, you know? So in this worldview, in this archaic Greek worldview, meaning doesn't come from outside. It isn't imposed arbitrarily by a creator or any other source. It comes from inside. The universe's meaning is what makes the universe itself possible. That the universe creates itself. It's endlessly creative, but it's creative according to its own logic and rules. And those logic and rules are the meaning of the world. And we can work out theoretically, you know, in this Greek cosmological sense, we could work out by studying the nature around and within us, as Heraclitus says, what the meaning of our lives ought to be, how we ought to orient ourselves, how to get into harmony with the world, and that we can then be in a position to evaluate our good and evil qualities in terms of whether they are healthy and sustainable and sane and lead to beauty and harmony, or whether they are, you know, discordant and selfish and destructive and lead us out of harmony with nature. And in fact, not only can we have a duty to, because that's the source of meaning, and we shouldn't live meaningless lives. And because if we aren't clear about meaning, then democracy stops being the good democracy and starts being the bad democracy, and literally everything falls apart without the Greek concept of an immanentalist nature in which meaning comes from within nature and we orient ourselves to it. So the archaic Greeks were very, very clear about this. And what's good about it is that it gives us a really crisp distinction between two different models. The medievalist model, which sort of inherited and transformed the Middle Eastern purity religions that it drew off of, and the immanentalist model, which as far as we can tell, go back to archaic indigenous cultures of the Peloponnese who were there before the Greeks ever came. The Greeks talked a lot about that their religion was a hybrid. It was a fusion of what they brought and what they found in the Peloponnese. So I like to think of, you know, the medievalist as a sort of purified, more modern oriented transcendentalist religion. It developed that level of sophistication where it could posit a whole other world in order to explain this one. Whereas the Greek is sort of a hybrid between some of those ideas and the idea of immanentalism. So you could see why the Greeks were arguing amongst themselves, why Plato and Aristotle and Parmenides and Heraclitus were having these arguments. It's like, is it the one or is it the other? Or is it somehow both? They're wrestling with it. They were struggling with it because they themselves were a fusion culture. They were, a kind of Creole, a kind of hybrid. And that's why, James, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did Hegel also struggle with that kind of, idea of the transcendental and the immanent? And he seems like he began with the idea of the transcendent God, and then ended up with this absolute that brought everything together. And the absolute seems like an immanent.
Yes.
God, nature and God are the same.
Yes.
The same thing.
Yes. Hegel, I think that's right on the money, James. Hegel's wrestling with this problem that on the one hand, we can look back to the Greeks and see them positing the possibility of immanentalist meaning. But on the other hand, you get this line of descent through Parmenides, Plato, and Kant, in which the thought itself and reason and ideas seem to exist outside of the world and be able to evaluate the world objectively if they're just rigorous enough. Mm-hmm. And that was his core argument with Kant, is to deny the possibility of the transcendentalist critique of nature. He said, your thesis, antithesis, synthesis is fake because it's just you imposing an artificial struggle between two things and then talking about how to resolve them into a synthesis. He said this was why he said that's why he said he never wanted anyone to use that terminology. The core of his dialectic was that the thesis and antithesis were actually two stages of development, not two arbitrary things pitted against each other. And that's why he brings up the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He says it's true that the bud and the blossom are antagonistic to each other, right? The blossom can't exist without pulling away from and developing out of the bud and becoming other. It has to other itself. It has to negate its prior condition, but it couldn't exist without its prior condition. It's not just some other thing we found somewhere and pitted against it in an argument. It arises from within it. And the resolution of the struggle between the bud and the blossom isn't that one or the other wins or that we compromise, but that we move on to some new state that's different from either one of them, such as the fruit. So in all of this, he's making it as clear as he can that he's trying to refound the intellectual tradition of the Renaissance coming out of the medieval tradition in a more immanentalist sense, in which we focus, we don't just allow for nature, but we center nature and we make it the critical metric for resolving these questions. Phil and then Marianne.
Yeah, could I ask this question then about contemporary science? Because on the one hand, it seems like it's at least moving more and more toward being immanent. But on the other hand, there seems to be an overlay of the transcendentalists in the sense that mathematics is still bearing down on just sort of looking at the world and building models, but there's the mathematics is going to structure the models. I mean, so in some sense, are we still caught in that? Or is that maybe the virtuous thing that is actually dualistic in the sense that it has to find a path between the two? I mean, because I see it both ways in one sense, because certainly in the 19th century, it seemed like, for the positivists, it seemed like it was transcendental in the final analysis. Right. But in terms of contemporary science, it seems to me the immanence is getting more and more of a foothold. As a matter of fact, in some ways, statistically, it's probably more dominant than the transcendentalists. But the transcendentalist still has, in some sense, the last word, because you got to prove it in a mathematical equation.
Yeah, and it's not just the math equation, because sometimes math can be extremely useful. It's It's the mathematization of
Yeah.
allowing which science will take place and which doesn't by saying, well, you don't have the funding, so you don't get to explore that. But I think you might make me some profit, so I will fund you and you get explored. There's this warpage that happens on the field of science that's imposed, we would say, from without, by the larger society, still being committed to a transcendental cosmos made up not of, and this is the big break of modernism that it doesn't like to talk about from the medieval era, made up not of God and virtue and meaning and good and evil, but made up of money. Because money is pure and perfect, and it's the same, right? It's just perfect, pure numbers that you could perfectly add up, that will perfectly tell you the value of things, and perfectly tell you which people are worthwhile, which ones aren't, and so forth. There's this mathematization that happens through the economization of everything, and that is an enormous warpage. But at the same time, you can see it as, and this is another thing moderns don't like to think about themselves as, that our entire modern epoch is a blossoming of the bud of medievalism, right? Medievalism broke with immanentalism. It was the revolution that overthrew naturalist immanental cosmos and replaced it with a transcendental one. And we're still continuing that line of development, but we decided that it couldn't be centered in God and meaning and nature, so we're going to center it in money and laws and other intellectual rationalized systems, and say, you know, they will give us our meaning and our organization and authority that we will then impose upon nature and decide what to bulldoze and what to plant.
This is a slight aside, but I need to interject this. I had this thought today, as a matter of fact, because we're arguing about the $1.9 trillion COVID aid, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the Republicans have some trouble with it because of the money.
Because money's sacred.
And I'm thinking, like, of course they would, because it's actually what the market structure says. Because you when you give the money to the rich people, that's just like the market. You know, when it goes high enough, you take the profits, and that's just a matter of taking the profit. But when you're like giving it to the poor people, that's like an expenditure, right? It's not the same category. It's not the same category, because now you have to pay out rather than take profits. So if you take the profit motive into it, then it makes total sense that when it's high, you take profits, and that's not a problem. But when it's low and you have to give it out, then that's an expenditure that the company can't afford. So there is actually a funny internal logic that doesn't make sense to me. But when I see it in that context of the market structure, I said, no, actually, this makes total sense according to them, right? Because they're not the same.
And this is one of the things that, and I'll call on Marianne and then Sharon in just a sec. This is one of the things that we struggle with in the modern era, is because we want to conceive of ourselves as being outside of nature and history. We want to think we're the end of history. History's done. And now we live in a perfect or nearly perfect or self-perfecting scientific world in which everything is made, decisions are made for the right reasons, and we will inevitably stride towards justice and goodness and truth. This is like a core concept of how modernism self-defines itself. But in truth, we're still religious. It's just we've replaced God with money. And and therefore it's not at all confusing once you see that analysis, why you would see warped versions of Christianity arising in the modern order, such as prosperity gospel. So could there be any version of Christianity more out of sync with what Jesus said as clearly as he possibly could, right? Camel, I have a needle. Could he have been, blessed are the meek, blessed are, how clear did he have to be to say the point is not money? And yet, under the tremendous warpage of the force field of the modern epoch and its conception of the world, that certain people felt like they had to reconcile Jesus with money and make it so that Jesus loves them, so Jesus gives them money. So you get this prosperity gospel cycle going, in which you can tell who the saved are because they're the ones who benefit economically. So what's happening there with those sort of warpages, that most Christians would look at and go, oh, come on, that's not Christianity. Jesus never said that. Jesus said the opposite of that. How could you possibly believe that that's Christianity? The confusion comes from not understanding the enormous pressure that the modernist epoch imposes upon our psychology at all times, telling us to quantify things in terms of money, that money is the source of meaning. It is how we orient ourselves, and everything should orient itself, not just people, not just nature, but even our conception of God gets warped into some sort of adjunct to the economy, just like everything else is becoming. So it's consistent, but only if you see the pieces that we don't like to talk about because they make us really uncomfortable, right? This is not compatible with our vision of progress, boldly, proudly striding forward to truth, justice, and all the other things. It's like these two things don't fit, which is why these critiques from Kenneth Smith and others are so illuminating in uncomfortable ways. Marianne and then Sharon.
So when you're talking about medievalism and transcendentalism, I have a bad reaction to it, because when I think of medievalism, I think of them burning women and taking the wealth of the women,
Yes.
Which was one of their motives, was to
Yes.
steal for women,
Yes.
so they wouldn't have an inheritances. And I think that it really was about escapism. It's not like the afterlife was an escapist thing. And transcendentalism to me is that inner mystic coming out like Thoreau. So just that language was really hard for me to put those two, transcendentalism and medievalism, together. I think there was a lot of greed and they were trying to escape, and they blamed women for a whole lot of stuff that we had nothing to do, and a lot of them were midwives.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and there's a couple of reasons why these go together with how do we say this? None of these movements that occur in the natural world, the actual world that we live in, is ever a pure precise form of the abstraction. So the transcendentalism of someone like Thoreau and the transcendentalism of someone like Torquemada are different aspects of transcendentalism. And so with some of the aspects, you're going to see a lot of virtuous stuff that's appealing. And with other aspects of transcendentalism, you're going to see a lot of really uncomfortable stuff. So an example of Torquemada's transcendentalism is the idea that the soul is eternal, but the body is not. So in the balance, if you have to weigh which of the two is more important, the soul is obviously more important than the body. So torturing the body for just a few days or hours in order to try to save an eternal soul that could then exist in bliss and in harmony with God for all of eternity, it's not a hard decision at all, because the transcendental nature of the soul and its infinitizing value diminishes the value of the body. And that goes hand in hand with the people who scourge their own bodies in the medieval era. It's like, well, I'm trying to prove to myself that my body is worthless and that my soul is the only value I have. So it's the impact of the infinite against the concrete, finite that we actually live in, where you sort of start to see these things come out in different shapes. And people can put them together in ways that exalt us or in ways that debase us. And so that's why you get these kind of differences. It has to do with the cultural inputs that are going on. And it's really uncomfortable stuff to talk about. Part of the sin of women is that the medievalist church had a strong run of patriarchy. And they did not, the early Christian church, uplifted women as prophets. Paul says repeatedly about the great women prophets and how people should follow them. But very shortly after Paul, there was a pushback, and a new generation of church leaders arose who were patriarchs and despised women, and they forged some letters and inserted them into the New Testament. We can tell by the language that they were written 100, 200 years later. that say, oh, women should be seen and not heard, all that kind of stuff that you can read in Timothy and elsewhere. We know those things weren't actually written by those people because they're using the wrong language. It was a counter reaction to try to shove down the authority of the women in the church and establish a patriarchy. And once it had been established, they then had to, follow the logic of their system and suppress women everywhere and try to turn them into domestic slaves and slaves of society. And so as a result, wherever Christianity spread to in the medieval era, they had to break up the authority of women to put the patriarchy in place. Right? So women as traditional repositories of lore, of wisdom, of decision-making, all those things had to be broken up in order to protect and spread the model that they were sort of trying to Xerox across the world. In their trying to approximate what they imagined a pure, perfect, everybody does the same thing society would be like, eliminating the diversity, eliminating the changes and transformations, eliminating the things that are natural and good but are out of harmony with their ideas, suppressing those. And so, but the scariest part about the burning and other forms of execution of women is how much of it happened after the medieval era. The Renaissance was the high point of the Inquisition. You got to go look at the dates on these things because we don't teach it this way. We teach that the Renaissance was an era of enlightenment that replaced a dark age of wickedness and violence. But when you look at the dates, what you find is that the worst of the violence happened during the Enlightenment. It's shocking. It's shocking.
So was it also the period of the Henry VIII period? Was that also?
Yeah, he's right in the transition too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
It's worth Googling the dates a little bit and looking at some of it comes before, but it really gets to its very worst with all the torture devices and all the things that they employed. A lot of that was the ingenuity of the new engineering that they learned. They learned how to use new means to do what previously they were more ineffective at. And they learned how to perfect, now that they could do printing presses, they could print the Malleus Maleficarum and make it easier for people to have copies of the books that tell you who should be tortured and who's a witch. I mean, all of the new technology played into these things. It's gross. It breaks apart our conception that we are raised with, that the Enlightenment was an era of rejecting ignorance and rejecting violence and discrimination and becoming good.
I'm wondering about that period you're talking about. I'm just wondering what was going on in Asia, China, Japan, and Korea.
Yes. I have so much more history I need to learn because I only know in the broadest strokes the medieval period in Japan and China and so forth. I certainly don't know it deeply enough to be able to apply this kind of analysis to it. But what we can say is each of these cultures had its own natural structures unfolding within it on its own timelines.
Bill, do you know much about that period that Rick is talking about in Asia? What was going on in Asia?
Well, not enough to talk about it in depth, but I mean that was the Ming Dynasty. It would be the Ming Dynasty, and China had not had a good history of treating women kindly, so I would not hold that up as a light for like, oh, this is in contrast to what's happening in Europe.
Yeah, so I don't think they were treating women very well in Japan either. Probably, I don't know about Korea, but.
Yeah, the Ming Dynasty era, we know from the Yin and Yang class we did was when they got that rise of Neo-Confucianism, when Confucianism figured out how to restructure itself to overcome Moism and the other competing religions, and it became the dominant centerpiece religion, and it carried with it a lot of patriarchy, the way that it was structured under Neo-Confucianism, which was not good for women. The Marianne, you keep mentioning, the author of The Alphabet and the Goddess, he's got fascinating stuff on this. That talks about the suppression of women coinciding with the rise of the written word, that the rise of literacy and thinking in linear forms lent itself to patriarchy for reasons that we're still trying to figure out. That almost every society, about the time it shifts over from an oral culture to a written culture, also shifts from a matriarchy to a patriarchy, if it was a matriarchy to begin with. And why that happens is stuff he explores in the book, but we don't really know yet. We're still just trying to figure it out. But it might be because the Verstand mindset lends itself, for some reason, more to patriarchy, or allows patriarchy to exert itself more, control the world, control other people. I don't know. It's got to be explored. It's such a huge pattern in history. We need to look at it more closely than we have, I think. So we've got two models so far, right? The medievalist model of good and evil and how that applies to the world. And then we've got this hybrid fusion model from the Greeks, in which they're sort of standing with one foot in the indigenous world and one foot in a new Verstand world of ideal forms, and they're arguing amongst themselves about it. But they give you two different perspectives on good and evil. And before I go on to the third perspective, the thing we need to look at is what did the Greeks have to say about the good or evil of human beings? And Emily Vermeule's book on aspects of death in archaic Greek art and poetry, which I mentioned last week and which finally arrived from the book dealer, and so now I'm reading it, is full of great Greek archaisms of the kind that you find in Heraclitus. So some of these lyric poets and epic poets had the same mindset as Heraclitus does. You can see it's not just him. It was largely the whole archaic Greek world that saw in terms of the immanentalist structure of nature and our need to look at it, and the huge struggle that human beings have to get out of their own heads and actually believe what's right in front of them. In that, they talk about the way that the Greeks talk about human beings is offensive to moderns. Moderns are based on the, Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man. It's based on that we are the most noble creatures, that we are the smartest creatures. Homo sapiens were the wisest creatures, right? And that we're just these fountains of goodness, and all good things flow from us. Is sort of somewhere. It's at least one of the major founding stories of modernism, as a rejection of medievalism. It's like Hegel's idea that the new system that arises doesn't just unfold from the previous system, but actively pushes it back. You can see that both with the medievalist rejection of nature as a source of meaning and turning to a nihilist view in which nature has not just less meaning, but no meaning, that it's absolutely evacuated of meaning and only God has meaning. All meaning is sucked out of nature. That couldn't be a more direct slap in the face against the entire ancient epoch. It was a revolution. There's just no way to say that it was just a continuation and just a gentle transformation. It was a revolution. The same is true of modernism. Modernism was a slap in the face against the medieval world. When Nietzsche said God is dead, he was describing the modernist rejection of God as the source of meaning. He said, now people want to give the world meaning through their laws, through their philosophies, through their economies. We will decide what has meaning, right? And we will no longer allow priests to tell us or holy books to tell us. And if you want a religion, that's just something you do on the side, like gardening. This was sort of the modernist premise, is that no more would we look to God for meaning. We would unless we wanted to personally, as some personal thing. But the civilization itself would be based not on divinely chosen kings and their fiats, but on constitutions that were crafted by the people, for the people, of the people. That phrasing, which took a while to arrive at, was at the core of modernism. And in doing so, it couldn't have been a more extreme shove back against the medieval worldview and cosmology. It went right for the throat, just like the medieval world had gone right for the throat of the ancient world. This is where it gets interesting when you look at the structure of their belief systems and where meaning comes from and how they decide what's good and evil. So for a modern to read what the Greeks had to say about the good or evil of human beings is just shocking, because they don't come at it transcendentally in a way that the modern world knows how to dismiss easily. They come at it naturalistically. We claim to be naturalistic, right? We claim the rise of science centers us in nature and truth more than the medieval world was centered in truth. We identify their transcendentalism indirectly, not using this terminology, but we identify the medieval transcendentalism as being its weakness, why it was so false, why it got so many things wrong, right? That maggots are not produced by rotting meat, but they're produced by other maggots. They're produced by flies. They come from living things, right? There's eggs, there's cycles of reproduction, and the medieval world didn't know that, right? But the moderns do. They say, we know more about nature. We are more centered immanently in nature than the ancient world, than the medieval world. That's what we say. That's our pride. So for the Greeks to come at us, not in the way that the medievals did, but in the way that we are supposedly vulnerable to, but to come at it with an exact opposite opinion from ourselves, is a slap in the face. If it was arising now, it would be, again, going right for the throat, the weakest part of modernism, to come at and say, you say you're about nature, but you are misjudging everything. Because if we actually look at nature, you've got all of this wrong. Man is not inherently virtuous, inherently honest, inherently the fount of all virtues and values, and all good things flow from him. They said, the Greeks were just very clear to say, man is just as able to be evil as good. Man is ambivalent, and not subtly ambivalent either. I mean, you go all the way from saints to sinners. You go all the way from cannibals to self-sacrificers. Is the worst and the best that are possible arise from humanity. And that's a very scary condition to be in. It's a very vulnerable position. And that it means that you ought to be putting everything you have towards ensuring that we grow up in the good ways and not growing up in the bad ways. And that's when the Greeks would look at us and say, so what the heck, moderns? How can you justify your economy or your politics or your system of education or how you organize anything? How can you justify that your music is mostly about escape and not about trying to help people become good people? Don't you know what's at stake if people become bad people? Don't you know how bad it can get? And of course, we look around ourselves at our holocausts and wars and genocides and go, yeah, it can be bad. We're clear on the fact that it can be bad, but we still aren't teaching the Holocaust clearly in school. We still don't teach the roots of U.S. slavery clearly in school. We still don't teach the Compromise of 1877 and how the Union gave away the Reconstruction in order to win a presidential election and allowed Black Americans to live in misery for over a century after that. We don't teach any of that stuff. We're still tiptoeing, pussyfooting around, trying not to plainly state the things that people most need to know in order to wrestle with good and evil in the world around us and try to be good people. The Greeks would say, what is wrong with you? How can you see the nature of human beings and then not work to shape us in good directions?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They would have searing critiques of how we've structured society. Ginny, go ahead.
But at the same time, Rick, it's one of the Austin groups did, in fact, we're still doing the ancient Greeks and Egyptians and Romans. And I think before Plato and Aristotle and all that, I mean, there was some cannibalism going on in Greece, in the Greeks. And I'm thinking, for the longest time, since I was in college, I had this absolutely romantic notion of Greeks, they were the founders of philosophy and blah, 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 blah. And then when I started hearing these lectures about Greeks, the other side of Greeks, not the aristocrats, but the common people and the lower slaves and all that, I thought, oh my God, Greeks were not any different than any other people throughout the world. They were not. What do you call it when you?
The beautiful nobles that we aspire to become.
Not
at all.
I thought they were inspired people. Anyway. How naive
that's a trenchant criticism, and it's necessary, right on the money. Nietzsche talks about this. He says the thing that's shocking to us about the Greeks is how savage they are, because you can be reading some beautiful oration about like you could be reading this passage in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where this amazing oration on the rights of human beings and why we ought to be kind to each other is immediately followed by the city being razed to the ground and the men all slaughtered and the women all raped and everybody sold off into slavery. And you're like, oh my God. And he says the thing that moderns can't get about the Greeks is that savagery was like part of themselves, and that they knew it, and that they mostly embraced it.
Yeah.
They were a warrior culture that had conquered the Peloponnese.
For them to have, forced Socrates to drink hemlock and, commit suicide because Socrates wanted to just talk about the better human, the
Right.
betterment of the human thinking and psyche and all that, blah, blah, blah. You can, I'm sure, articulate it better than I do.
Yeah.
But, that alone is pretty, I mean, right? I mean, I'm talking about, yeah.
So yesterday was the anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a new article out that talks about Ray Wood giving a deathbed confession that when he worked to arrange to have Malcolm X's bodyguards arrested shortly before Malcolm X was assassinated, he was doing that at the bidding of the FBI and the NYPD, who had conspired to arrange the whole thing. They'd increased the rage between Nation of Islam and Malcolm X's side to wipe them up into a murderous frenzy, and then they arranged to remove the bodyguards from Malcolm X so that Nation of Islam would assassinate Malcolm X, so that afterwards they could say, oh, we didn't have any hand in this. We didn't kill him. This was black on black violence. We had no part of it. But now it's documented that they set the whole thing in motion and arranged it. So, when we talk about brutality and we talk about, these different epochs, on the one hand, they, Athens put Socrates to death, but on the other hand, we assassinated Malcolm X, who again was just saying, can't we be nice to each other? Can't we stop, treating black people so horribly? Shouldn't there be equality? Shouldn't people be, treated appropriately? And our country at that time was like, not only no, but we're going to kill you for saying that, because we need you to stop saying it, because you're making us look bad, man.
Have you seen the film Do the Right Thing?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in that movie, by the way.
You are?
Yeah, the entire movie takes place in one block in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and we shot it in 8 weeks. I worked on it for 5 weeks. Anyway, it takes place in the Korean grocery store, Italian pizzeria across the street, and in the street. And I am the woman in the Korean grocery store that's seen with Radio Raheem, coming in and trying to buy battery. That was me.
It never occurred to me why you looked faintly familiar to me. Oh my God, I saw you. Wow.
Thank you. Yeah. And,
part of
that film is about Malcolm X.
Yes. Yes.
And in fact, all the actors were escorted back and forth from the where we had food. I keep forgetting the term that we used in on the movie set. From the actual set to the dining area and all that by people of Islam. They would escort us to everywhere we went, because
really
at Bedford-Stuyvesant you never know what could happen, so actors were escorted everywhere.
That's amazing. So Nation of Islam was right there escorting you
they
safely.
were in their uniform escorting us everywhere we went.
Wow, that's amazing.
And when you think of that movie, Samuel Jackson, Giancarlo Esposito, all these guys, when we were shooting the movie, we were all nobody was a big star yet. Everybody with a very collegiate atmosphere. We were all buddies. Martin Lawrence and John Turturro.
Spike Lee.
Huh?
Spike Lee.
Yeah, Spike Lee. Of course, his film. He wrote it, directed it, and produced it, and all that. But
it was incredible.
And to this day, John Turturro I've spent many Thanksgivings at his house. We're friends.
Small world, Jenny. I never would have guessed the philosophy seminar was going to cross over in such a personal way with.
Well, I felt
one of my favorite movies.
Just was like I was introduced to one philosophy course in college, and I was like, oh my God, black hole. So I've been interested in philosophy since, and I had a boyfriend who was really into philosophy in New York when I was in New York doing theater and all that. And but I didn't do philosophy for the longest time. And then all of a sudden we have pandemic and we have Zoom going on, so that you can meet people like Sharon and Professor Marshall and all these people and listen to good philosophy.
Yay. Yeah. But the point you bring up, about the Greeks, it has to be talked about, that the problem with the human condition is that we are trying to discover questions like good and evil that really matter to how we're going to treat each other and how we're going to behave. But all our sources are flawed. It's like there isn't this is the repudiation of the medievalist ethos. The medievalist ethos said God can purely tell us right and wrong. And so if we just turn away from people and turn away from nature and look at God, we'll get the pure answers. But what we discovered through the medieval era is that there's all of God's media for telling us right and wrong come through human beings, whether as authors of books or scribes of books or as priests or as, our parents who raise us growing up, and that the message gets filtered and transformed through the lens of the person and their intentions and what they want to have happen. And that as a result, if we pretend that it's impossible for all these human vehicles for divine truth to be incorruptible, then what we do instead of getting a perfect access to truth and goodness is that we create a perfect medium for corruption. Right, the big pushback of that led to the modernist revolution against the medieval epoch was the massive corruption, open buying and selling of like indulgences. You're going to hell unless you give me money. Okay, give me money, now you're going to heaven. This sort of stuff was so corrupt that nobody could deny anymore that the promise of the medieval epoch had completely collapsed and become its own opposite. And yet, there are plenty of medievalist writers who have profound things to say on these issues, just like in the ancient epoch, at the same time that you've got some people, murdering everybody and selling everybody into slavery, you've got other people, writing, what if we were just nice to each other? And hey, maybe getting access to the truth is hard. In each of these epochs, we sort of have to really filter and dig around to try to find the philosophical gems among all this dross. Just like Heraclitus says, searchers after gold have to turn up a lot of dirt. Sharon and then Phil.
Well, talking about evil, what's happening in Texas now, in my eyes, is evil. And I want to just piggyback on what Phil says. I mean, here you have suffering imposed on people because a group of people, and I assume rich people, decided not to make the intervention that was necessary. Even though the weather is changing and is getting more severe, to take care. And so what you have, and it's concentrated at the lower socioeconomic level. No, that's evil.
Right. I would entirely agree.
Yeah, and you guys already discussed it. I'm sorry, I have to step away for a bit. Some of these people in Houston is one of the cities where they are socked with electric bill of $12,000.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah.
And also it's a massively gerrymandered state in which, people are not getting the government that they want to get. And so a lot of what happens to them, other parts of the country might want to scoff and point their finger and say, well, that's what you get. But it isn't what they get. They didn't make this happen. They're victims of it, not the creators of it. I'm
sorry, how I don't understand what you mean by that, Rick.
So there's a term we don't use in America but we should, called political slavery. And political slavery is when we call you free, but we make sure your vote doesn't count. And so you don't actually get a say in your own governance. You appear to. We might go through the motions, but either you couldn't get ID to show at a polling place, or your handwriting wasn't legible enough, or we just closed down voting places and you stood in line all day, and then at the end of the day you never actually made it to the front of the line, go home. And there's like countless reasons why you could be made into a political slave despite being nominally free. And that's the condition of a lot of people in Texas. Where for just about every stratagem you can imagine to make their vote meaningless has been applied to block them from being able to exercise the franchise. And so as a result, it's just cruel for other places to then mock them and say, well, you chose this and you deserve it because this is what you set in motion.
I did not.
Well, but lots of places do.
I know. I'm just.
Yeah. Sharon, then Phil.
I really want to get in on this because something happened that really was very annoying to me. Black voters, particularly again, the lower socioeconomic level, on Sundays when you come to church, there's a thing called Souls to the Polls, where you would get in a bus, and if you don't have transportation, and they would take you there. my husband was African American. That was the first time I saw it. And it really, really works very, very well. Now, the legislators, I think in a couple of states, and Georgia, because I'm South and I hear it, are trying to ban voting on a Sunday so they could eliminate souls to the polls. Now, that is political slavery. And I like that term.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, Phil, go ahead.
It seems to me political slavery is another manifestation of appearance versus realities. Except at this juncture, it seems like the veneer has become transparent enough that it's not going to fool it's going to fool less and less people. So I think that the appearance is going to give way. Now, whether it's going to give way in this cycle or more slowly, I don't know. What I want to say about the Greeks is it seems important on one level to know that there was brutality on other levels that, that we don't study the philosophies and all that. But I want to emphasize, somehow it's important to not overstress that, because I'm thinking of somebody like Sophocles, like Oedipus Rex. I mean, he was talking about a man that is virtuous and yet flawed, right? I mean, which is exactly what we are.
Right.
And that in some sense, because of his flawness, he brought devastation upon the city. But that's not what he wanted to do. And when he realized it, he erected a punishment for himself, and he was finally, in that sense, a kind of virtuous person for at least acknowledging that he's flawed. I think that's different from somebody who just purposely done evil,
right?
Not because of his flawness. He knows he's doing it, and he's doing it to take advantage of a situation. And this is a completely different situation than that. Let's say the more idealized Greek, who is not who understands that he's not perfect, but he's trying to become as good as he can be, considering that he's a flawed person, right? And that's why he's called a tragic hero. He's not called a tragic, ruthless taker. I mean, he's a hero in a sense, because he's exposed to us our own weakness, and that we should learn from his weakness that is also within us. So I appreciate that of all the stuff, they didn't throw away Sophocles.
Yes.
Because
so grateful.
Like,
so grateful.
That maybe some of the other things that it's also important to know. Losing a bit of that is probably not as important as we have lost Sophocles.
Yeah, I did a Sophocles play Antigone when I was in college. He did some good things. He wrote some good plays. I mean, and Antigone, she's the title of the girl, and he I mean, in that instance, the heroine girl, from that Greek period.
Right.
So yay for Sophocles,
Yeah, that's right. There's this saying that Kenneth Smith, it's a quote, I'm sure, where he says the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. And part of what he's talking about is it's during the difficult times that people become philosophers. Because during the easy times, their society seems to be working. And so the culture envelope that stands between you and nature doesn't seem to exist. You seem to fit in with everything, and you forget what an artifice the culture itself is. Mm-hmm. You start to think that that's the way the world is, that's the way people are, and so on. But it's when you get into crisis that you start to ask the questions like, how could this have happened? And did we have to do things this way, or was there another choice? You'll see Kenneth Smith quotes Black Elk Speaks a lot. I don't know if any of you have read Black Elk Speaks. I'll put that in here.
Black Elk, ELK?
Yes.
Black Elk. Okay.
Yes, he was an Indigenous American who narrated his life story before he died. He had been a shaman, a medicine man among his people, and he lived through the arrival of the European colonizers. And so he describes what life was like before they got there, what it was like when they arrived, and how the world was transformed. And one of the things that he says in there is that, life was so good and he gives you details of what it was like, that they simply couldn't have imagined. Not one of them, not the smartest, most creative person who'd ever lived among their people could have imagined what was going to happen. They couldn't have foreseen it. Their wisdom wasn't enough. Their foresight wasn't enough. It was inconceivable. But once it was set in motion, then they could all start thinking about it and talking about the ethics of it. But it wasn't even a subject before that. It couldn't come up. And so, with the Greeks, on the one hand, the chaos caused by their conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Peloponnese created a philosophical ferment, right? As the struggles and disagreements and arguments happened about, the right way or wrong way to do things. But then also the transformation from an archaic, mythos culture to a classical logos culture meant that they were debating themselves and right and wrong and how you make decisions about the world and documenting it the whole way. If they'd just been in a stable, peaceful state, they would not have been a philosophical people. It's the chaos which came along with violence and cruelty and other things that made them ask the question, why do people do this? And is this even okay? And are the rationalizations and justifications that we had in our youth, do they stand up anymore now that we're seeing the consequences that they lead to? Phil, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I want to make a comment about Antigone and Oedipus Rex. Sophocles wrote Antigone first, even though chronologically, narrative-wise, it came second. And I think he wrote Antigone as being too perfect. In some ways, I think of Antigone as almost being transcendental. He was obeying the laws of God and not understanding the behavior of the world enough to have compromises. And so therefore, in a sense, she was virtuous to the death. She didn't have to be. Okay. And I think he wrote Oedipus Rex after that because he realized she was too perfect and he needed somebody who was actually more human, who was a noble person, but on the other hand, flawed. Whereas Antigone's flaw was she was too perfect in a sense, right? You couldn't find a flaw with him. And I think that's why Oedipus Rex was in some sense a greater a play, because it was more gripping about who we are as individuals. The important thing is that both of them were noble people. One was more perfect, the other one was more flawed. But there's a difference between just pure goodness and just also nobility. They were all trying to do the right thing, and they did the wrong thing in spite of that. So,
well, a very interesting take, Phil. That was very good. Yeah.
So when you read these archaic Greek critiques of human nature and whether we're good or evil, it is shocking for us. There is no question that compared to us, the Greeks were misanthropists. They were misanthropes. They had very unkind things to say about us, and they said it directly and bluntly. They said there were three fundamental criticisms they had against our species. And the first fundamental criticism is that we die, and we die in such a short time, right? That we are mortal, and as a result, all the good things that we are experiencing and trying to set in motion collapse when we die. And that's devastating, because it means we keep resetting back to the beginning of the race. The species keeps unlearning things. And they say, yes, that happens to other species too, but they're better suited to it, right? They're born, most of them, already at some level of competence in the world. Whereas we're born in this shockingly helpless state in which we have to learn a tremendous amount just to get to the starting gate. The point at which we can first start asking questions about ourselves, or like walk around and do the things that are distinctively human, is like, it takes ages. It takes, so long. That the helpless stage of infancy, it shows the degree to which we're sort of resetting and having to start over again. So our mortality, and that's why they said the gods pass away, but not in the way people do, because the way people do is just bad. It's just bad. It's not good. Then they said the second problem is our creativity is so deeply flawed. The things we create pass away so soon after us. Even the most fearsome works that we can create, the strongest, most enduring works we create, they fade away. And it means it's like running in sand. It's like, yes, we could pass on new things to the next generation, but the things that we pass on are falling apart while we're handing them off. It's like the gods, the immortal part of what makes the gods is that they can create works that are, endure forever. In theory, they have the Cyclopes, and they have Hephaestus the smith making these the thunderbolts of Zeus and these amazing artifacts, and they'll exist for all time and be an inspiration for people forever. But the things we make are like little reflections of them that then pass away. So the mortality of our lives, the flawed creativity, and then the third critique, the third part of the fundamental criticism is that God, we are so stupid. I said human beings just lose track of reality at the drop of a hat. It's so weird how confused we can get about the most basic things. So, and this is one of the places where other species have an enormous advantage over us. It's like, wolves don't suddenly start eating dirt one day and forget that they're supposed to eat deer. They just don't do it. Right? I mean, maybe you could get one sick one somewhere as a specimen to prove, well, it happened. But it's not like whole civilizations of wolves will all go suddenly start eating dirt. But people will do almost anything. There's like no telling what human beings will get into their minds and think next. I know, let's tear the hearts out of people and burn them on an altar. I know, let's all kill each other. I know, let's cut down every tree in the forest and then wonder where the forest went. It's like these things that people do. The Greeks were like, this is just shockingly stupid. And we know now that the reason is we just don't have enough instincts, right? The thing that made us so smart, that makes us born so fragile, is an evolutionary trick by which we retain certain traits into adulthood that other species lose in their infancy. But by losing some of those stages, like we're not hairy anymore, right? We lost all our fur. But by losing some of those later developments, along with them, we lost a whole mess of instincts that would have told us basic things like, don't eat rocks. don't, when you're thirsty, you should drink some water. There's all this stuff that other animals keep with them into adulthood that, sure, they're creative, sure, they're individual, sure, they think, but they've sort of got this rich frame that's always pointing them in the direction of generally healthful, sustainable behavior. Whereas we're missing so much of that stuff. You just never know what crazy idea is going to get into our head from one day to the next that we're all going to start doing, and it's going to just be disastrous for us. We're like missing the basic, training wheels or the stripes on the road or whatever the things are that sort of point us in the right direction. We're missing that stuff. And so as a result, we're just constantly confused and confusing each other about what's right and what's wrong and what's the good. Aristotle talks about this, the way other animals seem to seek the good instinctively. But our problem is that we don't seem to have any instincts for the good at all. And we really have to struggle to figure out which way we ought to be oriented. Marianne and then James.
When you're talking, I'm struck by how that machine, like we're trying to create a machine. And so our children can Google the answers so they don't have to start all over again. And that creativity doesn't have to be temporal anymore. And even God lasting forever, people think that they can take their brains and put them in some gel and that brain can live forever. And what I see in that patterning is not accepting the organic nature of us. And I think that the elders in traditional societies taught us not to eat the dirt. And I feel like we need an elder revolution, that we have to accept ourselves, that we are the help that is needed in the world sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, the Greeks came around to this same position, this idea that, other species may benefit from each other and need each other and help each other, but they aren't as just like crippled without each other as we are. One of them could leave the herd for a while and go about its life and do some useful things before coming back. Whereas with a human being, you never know if they're going to make it or not. So they said, we need culture like a prosthesis to make up for the missing parts that we don't have. The culture has to guide us towards water and away from fire, or else, you know, somebody's going to run into a burning building and incinerate themselves. They're going to put their hand on the hot stove because they don't know any better. You need the culture, you need the parenting, you need those things in Homo sapiens to a more extreme degree than you do for other species. Even when they have parenting, they're not as just like, they at least have more that's going to unfold naturally and point them in a right direction in them than we do. James, then Sharon.
Yeah, that's why Plato says in his dialogues that you know, we don't pursue evil intentionally. You know, we are always trying to do good, but it just turns out that, you know, indirectly or however, like you know, Oedipus, we commit these evil acts, you know, and without helping ourselves, and that's why Freud, you know, when he developed his theory of psychology, he, you know, used Oedipus, you know, for the major complex, right? And that, you know, even with that, originally he posited that the pleasure principle was the guiding, you know, motive in our lives, you know, but eventually came around and posited the death instinct, you know, that we are naturally self-destructive from the time we're born. And we just can't help ourselves, right?
Yeah, people who really try to do justice to the whole picture of human beings and the range of what we do and why we do them often end up just scratching their heads and ending up with, you know, like the Greeks, we end up with sort of a misanthropic perspective, which is that we are seriously in need of help, that we're not finished, and we're not naturally always homing in the right direction. We really need some assistance to keep ourselves from, you know, it's like no other animal species digs in the earth, creates fire, forges a knife, and then stabs himself in the eye with it and goes, "Ow, why has this happened to me?" It's like the amount of labor we put into the kinds of mistakes that we do just go far beyond what a bee or a tree will do. You know, they don't go so far outside the range of healthful things for such a long time to create accidents that could only have happened to Homo sapiens. You know, it's like one of the things that I say at work sometimes is there's certain classes of mistakes that it requires a tremendous amount of intelligence to bring about. You have to do a huge amount.
That's very true.
Huge amount of history and intelligence and dedication and culture to do something this stupid. Sharon, go ahead.
So the struggle is to be good.
Right.
And the great one of the factors underpinning that struggle is pain.
Yes.
And pain, and one of the things that I think about sometimes, pain enhances or facilitates the evolution of the good.
It can.
Or not.
It can. I'm putting a little quote in here. It's from Agamemnon, a tragedy written by Euripides. "Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain." And this is
I like that.
Paraphrase. There's a longer version of it in the play itself. This is a paraphrase, but Robert Kennedy quoted this at his eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. And it has to do with the fact that, you know, when the classical Greeks talk about us being just bewilderingly stupid, one of the things that they're saying is it's not that we have to be this way, right? We are hugely variable. We can be a lot smarter. Just like we don't have to be evil, we can be good. Neither the evil nor the good, neither the smart nor the stupid, is intrinsically locked into us, right? We have a range, and we have mechanisms in us to allow us to correct that range. And if we're lucky and they come out right, they will drive us in good directions. So sometimes we learn from pain. Sometimes people, like the Buddha talking about his experience under the bo tree and thinking about what he encountered in the world, came to the conclusion that the awareness of pain can lead to compassion. It can lead to, well, if I don't like this happening to me, maybe I don't like this happening to anybody, right? Maybe I shouldn't just be focused on whether I feel good. maybe I should be thinking about whether other people are okay too. And, maybe we could work together so that, there's always going to be some pain, but maybe we could minimize the artificial pain, and maybe we could commiserate about the unavoidable pain that's part of life. And maybe we could make our lives better through an awareness of pain and using it as an organizing principle. And, that realization that he comes to and, forms a whole religion around it was not a transcendental realization. It wasn't an epiphany from above. It was a discovery from within. And so it's part of the human condition that we are oriented in such a way that there are huge opportunities for us to learn how to be good and how to be wiser than we are, just right here in nature, waiting for us to notice and learn from them. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, in one of my artist statement, I said something that is very similar to that. And toward the end of the artist statement, I said, when one suffers as all living things suffers, in the anonymous pain of suffering.
Yes.
In other words, one has to transcend, is my pain, is your pain. Of course it is. But when you really think of in this matter, you realize the pain is actually anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes it universal. And I said at the end of that statement, that is the elemental, this is the locus of elemental empathy.
Yes.
You do not understand this anonymous pain that all living things, now rocks do not suffer this pain, but all living things suffer this pain. And that's how you begin to universalize it in some sense and have compassion, not only for other human beings, but also for other living beings
right.
on some level.
Right.
People have asked me, why don't you angels have faces? Because they're all kind of blank. And I said, because I want them to be anonymous.
Yes. Yes. So that they could be universal for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this goes right to the heart of this ethos, right? That Euripides is talking about, and that the Buddha is talking about, and that our natural human condition can lead us toward goodness, and it can lead us toward wisdom, and it may not. It might lead us the other way. We might become more selfish and more stupid, but we have the potential, and because the potential is there, sort of we are an ambivalent species. If we were to evaluate our goodness or our badness, we can't say that we're good, and we can't say that we're bad, and we can't say that we're in the middle, because we're not just in one place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the diversity of people, that people are in different places, but even any single individual at different times in their life may be in different places. Like you say, Oedipus, right? Oedipus before and after his realization. Oedipus in Oedipus Tyrannus versus Oedipus at Colonna later in his life, after he's gone through this experience. Who is he then? He transforms. He's flowed. His balance of goodness has shifted in him, and his balance of insight has shifted in him. And that could be true for any of us. And then to add the extra layer on top of it, like Marianne's talking about when she talks about Amazon and how easy it is, and how at the same time she doesn't want to be in the warehouse and doesn't want anybody else to have to be in the warehouse. We are typically in multiple different places on the good evil spectrum for all the different threads that pass through us in our lives at one moment. So in some ways there are ways in which I'm good, and there's other ways in which I'm evil in different places where I haven't done the work in one place that I have in another place.
Well, I think there's another level that's in some ways that's deeper, that drives it, is that for some reason human beings have an insatiable appetite. We have a good stuff and we want more good stuff. And I have this example in terms of, let's say, a lion is the king of the jungle or whatever it is, we don't blame it for killing an antelope. But a lion is not, after killing one antelope to satisfy his need, his appetite, he doesn't go around thinking, I think I'll kill 9 more. And you will ask, well, why? So, well, because I'm the king of the jungle, for heaven's sakes.
Right.
Well,
The person will totally do that.
Right. It's like we have somehow some insatiableness that even transcends our needs. And I think that's the first, if we could get control of that and just like tone it down to what your needs are, then I think you'll find it easier to be on the side of empathy. Yes. But if you don't, like, you know, well, why should I care? Because, you know, I won 3 more TV sets. Like, one is not good. See, I think that's where the problem is. And capitalism, in some sense, and the market economy drives us to this insatiability.
It does. It drives us towards it, and it admits it openly. It doesn't even pretend anymore that it's just trying to meet our needs. It acknowledges that it's trying to shape our needs, our desires, to make us want more so that we'll consume more, so that we'll turn the wheel of the economy and make it go.
You know, I recently saw a commercial that was I was kind of offended because this was done by Damian Lillard, who I like as a basketball player. You know, he was singing this song about whatever the product was. And he said, you know, and the guy said, no, you have to sing this and that. And he said, no, I'm not so sure if I can. And the guy opens up a big suitcase of money. And then you see that he's singing the song as the, and he's openly admitting, like, okay, he's bought out. And that's okay. Right. I mean, it's like, I said, Damian Lillard, like one of my heroes, like, come on. Like
this is not okay.
I know, it's okay.
Oh God.
It sounds like a Borat moment.
It does, doesn't it? Marianne and then Joseph.
So I'm always contemplating climate change. Yeah. And I think of Texas and the heartbreak, but a lot of the heartbreaks are happening regionally, like California, Texas, and then we disassociate. And I don't know how to have hope when everything is so fragmented. So I'm looking for that.
It's one of the hardest things about living during an era where there are so many things that should be better than they are, is that it's impossible to do what comes naturally to you if you want to be a good person, which is you want to go fix all the problems. But you literally can't. Like each one of those problems is a lifetime of work, and they're all happening at the same time all around you. And so you end up with this difficult situation where you sort of have to focus on what it is you're going to try to move in a better direction, while somehow carrying this huge burden of all of the things that are wrong that you're ignoring, that wear at you because you know they need focus just as much as the thing you're focusing on. It's just that it's impossible to do what's required of us, which is to go, you know, immediately solve all the problems. We live in this state of sort of existential dread in which we are allowing things we don't want to allow, and coexisting with things we don't want to coexist. We want to make it better.
Can I tell Marianne something? Even in my own family, my niece is working on a postdoctorate in climate, atmospheric science, my niece. My son got his graduate degree in green energy. And in fact, he's working for Austin Energy in the renewable energy department. So even in my own little family, I do have this generation, if you want to call them millennial generation, doing good things about the environment. So, yeah, I think there's a little bit of hope.
There is.
Right, Marianne? Marianne, where are you coming in from?
I'm from Bainbridge Island, which is near Seattle.
Yeah, it is. All right, Joseph, then Sharon.
I'm just going to briefly comment is that the idea of incentives, as incentives change, like if the system changes, then I think those are the things that will actually help us combat climate change, things like that. And I think that will, but there's a lot of entrenched, like, belief systems, I'll just say, that and desires like that people have towards consumption that are going to make that very, very difficult to overcome. But I think it will be overcome it just will take a little bit more time than we would like, and maybe even a few more disasters. Unfortunately, that's the sad reality. But speaking about also building off something that Phil was saying, with the idea of needs being met and our tastes being, or our desires being insatiable, the whole entire system is built around us not being content. Like, that's the entire point of the system, is that we're going to consume more, and that'll actually grow the system. Therefore, that's the only way we can actually move forward. And until that, like, kind of the perverted incentives change, that attitude will always exist. And in fact, will be driven towards consumption from marketers and things along those lines. So it's not even our attitudes. I think it's in our nature, actually, not to overconsume, to believe it or not. I really do believe that. But I believe that we're in a system that that incentivizes, or even, tells us to consume. Therefore, that way, that whole since that's broken, that unfortunately that's the way we behave, and those are the results of our actions. That's all I just wanted to add really briefly.
Yeah, I'm gonna call on Sharon in a second, but I want to underscore that, part of it, you can see it here in the Pacific Northwest, where the Columbia River used to run with ulachan, candlefish smelt, so heavily that you could see their backs from one side of the river to the other. And the Native Americans used to tell the story that even though you could imagine walking across the river on their backs. There were so many of them. And then that was just smelt season, because then in salmon season, the same thing happened, and the river was full of salmon. There were so many of them. And I was just reading up on how long had the Salish peoples been living here at the time when we saw that level of abundance. And the answer is, we know they've been here for many thousands of years. We can find evidence going back at least 5,000 years. And of course, it could have gone 10, 20, we don't know how long they were here. But for thousands of years, their relationship to this kind of level of natural resources was to preserve it. They simultaneously fed themselves and also regenerated the ecosystem, such that it was like impossible to imagine any more fish could fit into that river when it was time for one of the runs. It's like, it didn't look like you could get any more in there, whereas it took us less than a century to completely empty it and get it to the point where all of our runs are endangered. They all have to be carefully managed as far as how many you're allowed to take, because if we took as many as we want to, they would immediately drop and go extinct. We've already pushed it as far as we can towards the level of barely hanging on. So you can see how much of it is not about the species per se, but is about the way the species has been incentivized by its culture, or in our case, by its anti-culture, which has put us out of harmony with the world that we depend upon to such an extreme extent that all of the natural resources are sort of shoved to the bottom subsistence level, which means the very first disaster to come along, pushes it outside the bounds of what's sustainable. And then we're all surprised. Who could have foreseen that nature has ebbs and flows, and that maybe instead of trying to make the bare minimum that can hang on, we should be making the most we possibly can so that it could survive even an enormous catastrophe. Like, we don't even think, because of the way our culture is structured, we think the opposite of the way that would make things as sustainable and healthy as possible. But we have the proof that people have done otherwise, just not in this culture. And maybe that's why we have to change our culture. Sharon, go ahead.
Addressing what Mary Ann said, unfortunately, I think change comes from hubris and chaos. And then you have, and that's where the hope is. And I live in South Florida, and I've lived here most of the time I've been here, and in Miami Beach. When I first moved here in the 70s, that was a nice place to go. Now, on a clear day on Miami Beach, you're walking around in ankle deep water, if not up to your mid-calf. And that's climate change. And the businesses have kind of modified. They're still there, but there's no definitive action to address it. And I was listening to Bill Gates talk because climate change is now his big thing. Now that he's predicted the pandemic, he's talking about climate change. He says all the beaches in Miami will be gone, and it's already starting. But it's like we're ignoring the chaos. We're ignoring what we're seeing. And I think that was point number 3 that you said, you lose track of reality. Or you see it and you deny it. So change has got to come through hubris and chaos. And you hope that the rest of us that survive, and I don't know the philosophical background of this, appreciate it.
And I don't know how many, sorry, Phil, I don't know how many people still think this way, but as I was growing up, the human beings seem to think that Earth is for us, you know, Earth is to serve us, you know. People, human beings, I don't think have, I don't know, maybe I couldn't say what percentage thought we are part of the earth, right? But not thinking that, oh yes, the pigs out there, the chickens out there, they're out there to give us food, to serve us, right? And so how can we have the human beings think differently about them being part of the nature and not trying to control the nature, thinking that it's, you know, the nature is out there for us, right? So Rick, what is the answer?
Oh no, I just bring the questions. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll make 2 points. One is like underscoring what Joseph said. I remember 9/11, I was kind of shocked by that statement, right? After 9/11, I think President Bush actually said the way to defeat Al-Qaeda is to go shopping. Otherwise, you just let them win, right?
Yes.
And so that was shocking, I thought. The other thing is, like, you know, back in the old days, you know, when I was going to college, it seems to me even a liberal situation about the environment was sort of like we have to manage the environment because we are, how should I say, the conservators of nature rather than being part of nature. And that was a very kind of almost liberal thing. We are still in control, but now we have to take the responsibility of tending to it, right? So to me, it's changed now further that we realize that no, we can't just be the manager as if we own the world, right? So in that short span of time, let's say 50 years, it has taken a big step.
It has, yeah. You know, Sharon, I didn't know about the Miami beaches and the ankle deep water.
Yes.
What it makes me think of is, you know, you can Google now, if you look at the road signs that have, you know, state roads often have a picture of the state on the sign, and there's these state roads in Louisiana that have a picture of map of Louisiana, and someone actually ran an experiment looking at the rise of the water flooding the bayous and flooding the places near the bayous, and redrew that map to show how much of Louisiana is now underwater. And Louisiana doesn't look the way that it does on the highway signs anymore. It's like the coasts are all infiltrated, and the whole state is riddled with these waterways that are eating away at the land as the water rises. But we still keep our maps the same and hide what it actually looks like right now, so that people keep being told over and over, in effect, don't worry, this isn't happening. Things are the way that they were when you were a kid. This still isn't occurring. So we get this jarring situation where they turn from our culture, which shows us this picture of a fine Louisiana just the way it always was. And then next thing they know, they step out of their house and they're like, well, but no, this doesn't look right. It's like, why am I standing in water?
Wasn't there a simpler solution to it? Just to say, used to be.
Yeah, right. So good versus evil. So, you know, the Greeks would, as a fusion culture, they take an ambivalent position on humans aren't good and they aren't evil, but they can be good and they can be evil and they can be all kinds of things in between. And it's incumbent upon us to lean on that and try to move the dial in a healthy direction. Because again, coming out of the Olympian Homeric project at the end of the Dark Ages, they knew so clearly how bad things can go wrong when we let the bad side of human beings rule. It could lead to the collapse, not just of a little thing, but of the entire Mediterranean civilization, which fell apart around the time of the Trojan War. So that's the second of the three positions, and of course we're down to the last 11 minutes. So I will make the third position on good versus evil as concise and brief as I can. The third one is a completely indigenous perspective. There's only one indigenous perspective I've been immersed enough in to be able to describe, and I can't do the justice to it that an indigenous Dene or Navajo person could do, but I know enough of it to be able to explain it. And their position is that they consider it the opposite of the medievalist apocalyptic worldview when it comes to good and evil. They say, my friend Harry Walters says to me, Christians think that evil is bad, good is good, and the purpose of good is to destroy, eradicate, and erase from the world evil, and that the world will be good when all evil has been erased and eliminated. And he says the problem is that's not how nature works. He says in nature, good and evil simultaneously coexist, and they both belong there. There are things that are natural, but that are not good, and you shouldn't be cozying up to, like a volcano, right? You can't hug a lava flow for long. I guess we have to add the for long. You're not going to be able to have a sustainable life cuddling up to lava, right? Lava is evil because you can't build a sustainable life around lava. But lava is necessary. Just because something is evil doesn't mean it should be eradicated or can be eradicated. Evil's a necessary part of the cosmos. And our job in creating a culture is to identify the good parts and the evil parts and come up with a way of life that usually keeps us in harmony with the good parts so that we're sustainable, but that keeps us aware of the bad parts so that in those rare circumstances when the harmonious way of life is not sufficient, you can carefully and with wisdom and caution, reach out and use a little bit of that evil to fix the problem. And then when you're done with it, you put it back and you acknowledge that you did an evil thing and that this is not the way we're going to live. And you go back to the beauty way, to the way of living in harmony. And it's sort of like the way he says medicines. He says they treat the general subject of evil like medicine. It's like just because aspirin is good for you under certain circumstances doesn't mean you should eat it as a food. It says evil things are like medicine. They're to be understood and studied and to be wielded in small, careful doses at specific times, but not used the rest of the time and kept locked away. You don't want your children eating aspirin, right? But you want access to aspirin. He says that's how good and evil work, and that what makes you a good person is that you know that and you live your life in harmony with that, and you don't try to make the evil things the normal part of your life, that you make them the augments, the tools, the technology that is brought in as needed and then put back away. He says they have all kinds of stories in the Navajo cosmology, all kinds of the origin stories talk about this core relationship between good and evil. And if somebody doesn't do that, for example, generosity to your relatives, being kind to one another, and being polite is part of the beauty way. It's part of harmony. It's good, inherently good to do those things. To exploit other people is inherently evil. And it's not that you should never exploit people, but that you should minimize it and only do it at the right times for the right reasons, with the right rituals to acknowledge what you did, and then putting it away afterwards when you're done with it and saying, now we're not going to do that anymore because that's evil. And he says people who get confused about that are considered not Navajo. They're not behaving. They're not living the Navajo way. They're not following the beauty way. They have lost the trail. And what they're doing now is living an evil life that is toxic to be around. Mm-hmm. And if you can help them find their way back, that's great. But what you can't do is follow them, because then you become evil too. And he says, so there's two terms that they use for this. And one of them is skinwalkers. if you've heard the Navajo term skinwalker, it's usually explained as a Navajo witch, someone who does evil things, but it's not the supernaturalist part of it that's important. The important part is that they have screwed up the balance between good and evil and are trying to make evil things a normal part of their life, evil strategies, evil modes of living. And that as a result, they cease to be fully human. To be human, you have to be kind to each other and good to each other and live in harmony. And when you're not doing that anymore, you're not really being human anymore. You're not really being a Navajo. The second term that's important here is the term Bilagana. Bilagana is a white person. These are the European colonizers. And I asked him, okay, so if Dene, the word for the Navajo, means the people, then what does the word Bilagana mean? And he said, well, he smiled and laughed, which meant I knew I was going to get, they like to talk obliquely a lot of the time when they're dealing with difficult subjects. And I've got different answers from him at different times. But one answer he gave is, it means the people who like to fight everybody all the time. They don't ever know how to stop fighting. They don't ever know how to settle down. And it was in a later discussion that he was able to connect the dots for me with that to this issue of living in harmony, living and walking in beauty versus doing the evil too often. He says what makes a Bilagana is that they have tried to make evil things their normal way of life. And as a result, they cause great harm to themselves and to all of us and to the world. And if they would find their way back to the beauty way, Hojon means beauty. If they would leave behind the Naye, the evil, and come back to Hojon, then they could be a people too. But until then, they're skinwalkers. It's like a world of sorcerers who prey on other people. And the reason I bring that up is even though Hopi and Navajo are different languages, they're neighbors, right? They talk to each other. They have interaction. And the films by Godfried Reggio, Koyaanisqatsi, Powakatsi, Nakoikatsi. I don't know if you guys have seen those. They're documentaries set to music with no words. They're just images from around the world, real world images with music by Philip Glass. Koyaanisqatsi is a Hopi word. Katsi means a way of life. Koyana means out of balance. Koyaanisqatsi means a life out of balance, out of harmony, right? They've lost the beauty way. Now, the second film, Powakatsi, the title is translated on screen as a life out of balance. Powakatsi, but that's not what it means. A Powaka is a Hopi term that means the Hopi equivalent of a skinwalker. It means basically a sorcerer who feeds on the life of other people. Powakatsi is a way of life in which you exploit other people and live off of them. And it's a really perfect term for colonizer culture. The hidden, he doesn't even translate it for us, but hidden right there in the open on the title credits of the second film in Godfried Reggio's series is the Hopi and by extension the Navajo and many indigenous peoples' critique of colonizer culture, which is that we aren't living a human life. We're living a parasitical, vampiric life in which we suck. Instead of other people benefiting from us being here, they're all suffering from us being here. We're living as a blight instead of as a blessing. And that we don't have to. That it's just how we've structured ourselves and how we've chosen to live. And if we live differently, we could become a blessing again, like we're supposed to be. Like indigenous cultures over the tens of thousands of years that they've been evolving have learned that you have to be if you're going to be a going concern as a species. You have to live a regenerative, harmonious lifestyle, or else you don't survive. Not those, all the ones that lived like we do now, that tried to do this sort of thing in the past, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, they all died out because it's not sustainable. And that's why indigenous cultures so universally have the same critique of colonizer culture, which is we are just not doing this in a sustainable way. We have lost the harmony that we need in order to survive. So that's an indigenous perspective on good and evil and how they relate to nature and how they relate to the human condition. Marianne and then Phil.
When you were talking, and I really appreciate all the pain and the wisdom that you have dropped down onto the earth and in this conversation. I appreciate that, Rick.
Thank you.
good transcendentalism there. But what it made me think of was the Tibetans, and I've been kind of like a dilettante in Tibetan culture. And one of the things that they do is they say that, you know, like you wear a mask, like when you have to be angry at somebody, you wear a mask. So it doesn't really quite get into your inner essence. And I like that, so I had to share it.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you. Phil.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the term because it seems like you're using it two ways. Because what at the beginning, the contrast seems to be not between good and evil, but between good and bad. Okay, which is different. But later on, when you're using it in terms of colonizing culture, then that is bad. That's to the point of evil. So that has two meanings to me, because it seems to me understanding that difference is important, because like you wouldn't say aspirin is evil, it's just bad in certain circumstances. I mean, so therefore using it in that term brings in a kind of ethics that doesn't belong to aspirin. But in terms of colonizing culture, yes, it does apply to good and evil. That contrast is different. So sometimes it's really in the language, and there's kind of a little skittish ambiguity there, exactly where you're going to divide it.
That issue you put your finger on, I want to underscore that, because that's really important. The Navajo conception of good and evil doesn't include what we call evil. They rule that out. They say pure evil, pure good. We don't see that in nature. We don't see any pure things in nature. So that's part of the world of imagination. Then in the real world, we see good and bad, and that they define their good and evil in terms of good and bad, so that, you know, what a person should do to be a good person is to orient themselves around doing the good things and thinking the good thoughts, and not eliminating, but controlling and limiting the bad things, the dangerous things. Dangerous is in some ways what they mean by nayeh, the things that you must use sparingly and only with great ceremony and as medicine, is somewhere, it's like a cross between evil, dangerous, and useful. It's like those three things at the same time. And so, like, you know, for them, aspirin is evil because they don't have the kind of evil we mean. They mean it's evil because it can't be a regular, sustainable part of our life. Only the things that can be a regular, sustainable part of our life are good, and everything else has to be treated carefully. So it's a different cosmology and a different conception. Yes. And then as a result, it has different bearings on how you would answer the question of, are people good or are they evil? This is one way to challenge the notions of what good and evil even are, and make us think about the question differently from an Indigenous perspective.
Well, thank you for the clarification.
Sure. Ginny, I think you're on mute. Oh, I can't hear you. David, can you see if she's muted? I'm not getting audio from Ginny.
Seems fine to me.
You hear her?
I don't hear her, but...
Oh yeah, we can see you talking, but we can't hear what you're saying now, Ginny. I don't know why not. Maybe your microphone or something.
The microphone on the computer.
Yeah, it must be the microphone on the computer gave out. Sorry, Ginny. I wish we could hear you, but you know, save it, write it down, save it for next time. It's not like we won't be here next week. Just don't forget it, because I'm sure it's good stuff.
Bad does not evil.
Technology, right? So, all right. So we're coming up on the wrap up. We were going to talk about today myth, soul, and earth, but we didn't. We talked about this other really interesting issue of human nature and good and evil and ethics instead, which I'm fine with. So maybe next week we tackle looking for the things that confuse us in essays 2 and or 3, if that's good with all of you.
Yeah, that is good with all of you. I have 2 questions though.
Yeah, shoot.
One question. So as this pandemic looks like it's turning the corner, are you going to give up on this Zoom format?
No,
because I will severely miss it.
I love this.
Yes. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Very happy.
I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Yes. No, I appreciate it. I'm learning. It's very interesting. I mean, I didn't mean to upend today's discussion, but it was tremendously interesting. And I could see lots of references to Kenneth Smith in your discussion in the essays that we were reading, and that was tremendously interesting. And the second thing, and this is on a lighter note, you look different, and I looked at you and decided you cut off your beard. Is that
I did. Let's see. You're right. I trimmed my beard. It was I was done with my pandemic beard. I wanted to go back to my normal beard.
I just thought you didn't want to look like Walt Whitman anymore.
I know. I was starting to look a little like Walt Whitman, to be fair. Yes. That wasn't entirely necessary. All right. Well, any parting comments before we wrap up for today?
Thank you very, very much. This was a very, very enlightening discussion, and I have lots of things to check on.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you.
You're most welcome. And thank you
thank
all.
you, Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I learned so much from doing these with you guys.
Yes.
Then we will see you next week.
Thank you to everybody.
And by the way, that quote came from a book that I read.
Yeah, it was nice to see everybody. Thank you.
He was a Christian theologist. I'm blocking on his name now. But the book was called The Problem of Pain. C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis. Right. I have that.
First sentence in that chapter of that book, The Problem of Pain.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Have a great week, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, everyone. Thanks.